I texted the family group chat from the airport bathroom. Hands shaking so badly I could barely type, "My flight lands at 6 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" 3 words I didn't write. I buried Oscar. My 12-year-old son, alone, 2,000 miles from home. The funeral was that morning. I held his favorite blanket while strangers lowered him into the ground because not one person from my family showed up. My sister Sarah's response came through while I was still staring at my reflection. Eyes swollen, makeup smudged, looking like a ghost of myself. "We're busy, just get an Uber." 30 seconds later, my mother Margaret added, "Why didn't you plan ahead? We have commitments." I stood there, phone in my trembling hand, and typed the only response I had left in me. "No worries." But I want you to remember those 2 words, because they were the last time I would ever make things easy for them. What my family saw on the evening news 6 hours later made their phones slip from their hands. What they didn't know was that their rejection wasn't just cruel, it was the biggest mistake of their lives, because buried in that coffin with my son was the woman who would take their abuse quietly. The woman who rose from that grave was someone else entirely. And before this story ends, you're going to watch me uncover the real reason my son died, a reason that leads straight back to my own mother's hands. They wanted me to disappear quietly. I'm about to become their worst nightmare. Stick with me. You won't believe where this goes. My name is Rachel Winters, and at 35 years old, I work as a freelance graphic designer, a job that allows me to work from anywhere, which had always felt like freedom until the day it meant I was 2,000 miles away when my son needed me most. I'd built a quiet, careful life for Oscar and me after his father left when he was 3, and for 9 years it had been just the 2 of us against the world. Now, it was just me. The wheels of my carry-on made a rhythmic clicking sound against the airport terminal floor, and I focused on that noise because if I didn't focus on something mundane, something concrete, I would collapse right there among the Friday evening travelers rushing past me with their weekend bags and their intact families. The fluorescent lights overhead felt too bright. The announcements over the PA system too loud. The laughter from a nearby gate too wrong. Everything felt wrong. The world had continued spinning while mine had stopped 3 days ago, and I couldn't reconcile that. How were people buying overpriced sandwiches and complaining about flight delays when my 12-year-old son was in the ground? I found a quiet corner near the baggage claim and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking. They hadn't stopped shaking since the phone call from the camp director, since the emergency flight across the country, since I'd stood alone at a graveside while strangers from the summer program offered their hollow condolences. The funeral had been that morning. 6 hours ago, I'd watched them lower Oscar's small casket into the earth, and I'd held his favorite blanket, the blue one, with stars that he'd insisted was too babyish to bring to camp, but had packed anyway, while my heart shattered into pieces so small I didn't think they could ever be reassembled. I opened the family group chat. The last message was from 2 weeks ago, my mother reminding everyone about some charity gala she was organizing. Before that, Sarah had shared a photo of her new car. Normal, surface-level family communication. We'd never been the type to share feelings or offer support, but surely this was different. Surely the death of a child transcended our typical emotional distance. I typed carefully, each word requiring concentration. "My flight just landed. I'm at baggage claim. Can someone pick me up?" I didn't write, I just buried my son. They knew. I'd sent a brief message 3 days ago with the bare facts. I didn't write, "I can't bear to take an Uber alone right now." That felt too vulnerable, too needy. I'd learned long ago that showing need to my family was like showing weakness to sharks. I imagined my mother pulling up in her pristine Mercedes, imagined her actually getting out of the car to embrace me, imagined her saying the words I desperately needed to hear, "I'm so sorry. I'm here. You're not alone." Or Sarah, my younger sister, who I'd protected from schoolyard bullies and helped with homework, arriving with tears in her eyes and open arms. My phone buzzed. Sarah's response appeared, "We're busy, just get an Uber." I stared at the words, certain I'd misread them. I read them again. And again. Busy. They were busy. I'd just buried my child, and they were busy. The phone buzzed again, my mother this time. "Why didn't you plan ahead? We have commitments." Something cold and hard settled in my chest, somewhere beneath the grief. This wasn't shock or surprise, not really. This was confirmation of something I'd known my whole life but had refused to fully acknowledge I had never mattered to them. Not when I won the art scholarship in high school, and my mother said it was nice but not practical. Not when I got married and she criticized every detail of the small ceremony. Not when Oscar was born and she visited once in the hospital, stayed 20 minutes, and never asked how I was managing as a new mother. Not when my husband left and I raised Oscar alone while building my career from scratch. And certainly not now in the absolute worst moment of my entire existence. Tears streamed down my face. A woman walking past with her teenage daughter glanced at me, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern, but she kept walking. Everyone kept walking. The world kept moving. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and typed my response, "No worries." 2 words. Automatic, reflexive. The same words I'd typed 1,000 times before when my mother forgot my birthday, when Sarah borrowed money and never paid it back, when they made plans without including me, when they dismissed my accomplishments and magnified my failures. No worries. The eternal reassurance that their neglect hadn't hurt me, that I was fine, that I didn't need them anyway. But this time, as I pressed send, something shifted inside me. Those 2 words felt different leaving my fingertips. They felt like the last time. The very last time I would make things easy for people who had made my life hard. I pulled my suitcase toward the rideshare pickup area, my grief now mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously close to anger. Oscar's voice echoed in my memory from a conversation we'd had 6 months ago. "Mom, why do Grandma and Aunt Sarah always treat you like that? You're amazing. You shouldn't let them make you feel small." I'd brushed it off, then made excuses about complicated family dynamics. But my son had seen the truth with the clarity that children possess. As I stood in line for a ride, my mind wandered to the past few weeks before Oscar left for camp, to the strange questions he'd asked about my mother's charity foundation, to the worry I'd noticed in his eyes that last video call. I'd been so focused on my work deadline that I'd dismissed his concerns. "Just focus on having fun, baby," I'd told him. God, what had I missed? The Uber driver barely spoke during the 40-minute drive to my mother's house in the suburbs, the house where I'd grown up, where I was staying temporarily while I figured out what came next. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, feeling completely hollowed out. I didn't know that at that very moment my mother and sister were sitting in Margaret's pristine living room, probably discussing their commitments. Probably not giving me a second thought. I didn't know that their phones were about to buzz with news alerts. I didn't know that within the hour everything would change. I never made it to my mother's house that night. The Uber driver had barely merged onto the highway when I realized I'd left my carry-on bag at the airport. In my fog of grief and shock, I'd walked straight past the baggage carousel without even thinking. That bag contained the only things I had left of Oscar from the camp. His clothes still smelling like him, the journal he'd been keeping, a few drawings he'd made. Panic surged through me, cutting through the numbness. I asked the driver to turn around, offering to pay double. He hesitated, then agreed. By the time we got back to the terminal, it was nearly 8 o'clock. The evening crowd had thinned slightly, but the baggage claim area still buzzed with activity. I spotted my bag almost immediately. Someone had moved it to the airline's lost luggage office. As I was explaining the situation to the attendant, I heard shouting from somewhere behind me. "Let go of me! You're hurting me!" The voice was young, a boy's voice. My entire body went rigid. I turned to see a man in an expensive suit gripping a boy's arm. The child couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 Oscar's age, and yanking him forcefully toward the exit. The boy's face was twisted in pain and fear. The man was hissing something at him, something about embarrassing him and learning to behave. Everything else fell away. The airport, the people, the announcements, the rational part of my brain that might have said this wasn't my business, that I should let security handle it, that I was in no state to intervene. All I saw was a child in distress, and all I felt was the primal, ferocious instinct that had defined my entire adult life: protect the child. I didn't think. I just moved. "Hey!" My voice came out stronger than I'd heard it in days. "Let go of him." The man looked at me with utter disdain, the kind of look that said I was beneath his notice. "Mind your own business. This is my son." "I don't care if he's the president's son. You're hurting him." The boy's eyes met mine, terrified pleading. In that moment, I saw Oscar. I saw every child who'd ever needed help and didn't get it. Something inside me that had been barely holding together simply snapped. I stepped between them and put my hand on the man's wrist. I said, "Let go." What happened next was chaotic. The man tried to push past me, shouting about interfering with his parenting. I stood my ground, keeping myself between him and the boy. Security started moving toward us. Other travelers had their phones out recording. The man's grip on the child had loosened in his surprise at my intervention, and the boy stumbled backward away from both of us. "Ma'am, step back," a security officer said, but I couldn't move. My legs had started shaking violently. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was draining away, and beneath it was the crushing weight of the past 3 days. I looked down at my hands and they were trembling uncontrollably. I started to say, but my voice cracked. He was hurting him. That boy. Someone had to. The terminal started spinning. The fluorescent lights became too bright again, too harsh. I could hear voices around me, but they sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. My knees buckled. The last thing I remembered was someone catching me as I fell, and a woman's voice saying, "Call an ambulance. I think she's in shock." When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, and a nurse checking my vitals. The clock on the wall said it was past midnight. For a confused moment, I didn't know where I was or why. Then it all came rushing back: the airport, the confrontation, the collapse. And before that, Oscar. Always Oscar. "You're awake," the nurse said kindly. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," I whispered. My throat was raw. "What happened?" "You fainted at the airport. You were severely dehydrated and your blood pressure was dangerously low. The paramedics brought you in about 4 hours ago." She paused, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry about your son. The news mentioned it." "The news?" The words sent a jolt through me. "What news?" She looked uncomfortable. "The incident at the airport. Someone posted a video and it went viral. You're kind of a hero. People are calling you the grieving mother who protected another child despite your own pain." Horror washed over me. Viral. Video. People knowing my story, my grief, turning it into content for their social media feeds. And worse, my mother would see it. Sarah would see it. They would know that their rejection had left me so broken I'd collapsed in public. No, I couldn't face them. Not like this. Not as the pathetic, fragile daughter who'd made a scene and needed rescuing. They would use this. They would turn it into proof that I was unstable, that I couldn't handle things, that I needed their management and control. "I need to leave," I said, pulling at the IV. "Whoa, hold on," the nurse said gently, stopping my hand. "The doctor wants to keep you for observation overnight. You've been through severe trauma and—" "Please," I interrupted. "I can't stay here. I just need to go." She studied my face for a long moment, and I saw the decision forming behind her eyes. She'd seen enough patients to know when someone truly couldn't stay. "If you sign out AMA against medical advice, I can't stop you, but I really think you should rest." 20 minutes later, I was dressed in my wrinkled travel clothes, discharge papers clutched in my hand, walking out of the hospital into the cool night air. I turned my phone off before even powering it on. I didn't want to see the messages, the calls, the inevitable cascade of concern that was really just control wearing a caring mask. I had nowhere to go. I couldn't face my mother's house, couldn't face their questions, and their judgment, and their barely disguised satisfaction at my public breakdown. I stood in the parking lot feeling utterly alone in a way I'd never experienced before. Then I remembered the cabin. 3 years ago, I'd used money from a particularly lucrative design contract to buy a small rundown cabin 2 hours north of the city. I'd never told my family about it. It was my escape, my secret sanctuary for the weekends when Margaret's criticism, or Sarah's casual cruelty, became too much to bear. Oscar and I had spent beautiful weekends there, just the two of us hiking and drawing and being free. I called another Uber and gave the address. As the city lights faded behind us and we drove into the darkness, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't running away. I was choosing to be unavailable. For the first time in my life, I was taking control of when and how my family had access to me. They wanted me manageable and predictable. I was about to become neither. The Uber driver didn't ask questions when I gave him the address, which was good because I had no answers to give. We drove north through the night, leaving behind the sprawl of suburbs and strip malls, climbing into the foothills where the air grew cooler and the darkness deeper. By the time we turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, it was nearly 3 a.m. The driver's headlights caught the weathered wooden structure nestled among towering pines, and I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. "You sure you want me to leave you here?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice as he took in the isolated location. "I'm sure," I said, and I meant it. I paid him in cash and watched his taillights disappear down the mountain road before turning to face my sanctuary. The cabin looked exactly as Oscar and I had left it 2 months ago, small, slightly crooked, with a porch that sagged on one side and paint peeling from the window frames. To anyone else, it would look like a dump. To me, it was the only place I'd ever felt completely free. I'd bought it 3 years ago with money from designing a complete brand identity for a tech startup. The contract had been substantial, and instead of telling my mother about it, instead of enduring her opinions on how I should spend it, her suggestions that I invest in Sarah's business idea or donate to her charity foundation, I'd quietly purchased this property. 1 acre of forest, a cabin that needed work, and absolute privacy. Margaret didn't know it existed. Sarah didn't know it existed. It was mine alone. Well, mine and Oscar's. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and old wood. Everything was exactly where we'd left it. Oscar's sketch pad on the coffee table still open to a drawing of a blue jay he'd seen outside the window. His hoodie draped over the back of the couch. A half-finished puzzle of the solar system spread across the dining table, something we'd planned to complete on our next visit. I made it 3 steps inside before my legs gave out. I sank to the floor, clutching Oscar's hoodie to my chest. And finally, I let myself break completely apart. The grief that came was different from anything I'd experienced in the past 3 days. At the camp, surrounded by strangers and administrators and counselors offering practiced condolences, I'd held myself together. On the plane, aware of the passengers around me, I'd kept my crying quiet and contained. At the airport and hospital, shock had numbed me. But here alone in the darkness, with nothing but Oscar's memory surrounding me, I could scream. And I did. I screamed until my throat was raw, until there were no more tears, until the violence of my grief exhausted itself into something quieter, but no less profound. When I finally dragged myself to the bedroom wrapped in Oscar's star-patterned blanket, the one he'd brought here on every visit, I fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. I woke to afternoon sunlight streaming through the window and birds singing outside. For 1 merciful second, I didn't remember. Then it crashed over me again. Oscar was gone. But this time the grief was accompanied by something else. Anger. I made coffee and sat on the porch, the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders despite the warm day. The forest stretched out before me, peaceful and indifferent to human suffering. I'd always found comfort in that indifference before, but now it felt accusatory. The world had kept turning. Life had continued. And I was expected to just... What Vaimana Septit? My mind drifted to the past, and once it started, I couldn't stop the flood of memories. I was 8 years old, playing quietly in my room while my mother hosted a lunch for her friends downstairs. I'd crept to the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of laughter, wanting to be part of the warmth and community I heard. That's when I heard Margaret's voice. Honestly, Rachel was a mistake. I wasn't ready for a child. I had plans, a career starting. But what can you do? The other women had murmured sympathetically, and I'd retreated to my room understanding for the first time that I was unwanted. I was 13 when I won the regional young writers competition. I'd worked on that short story for months, pouring my heart into it. I'd rushed home with the certificate and small trophy bursting to share my achievement. Margaret had glanced at it and said, "That's nice, dear. Don't let it go to your head, it's just a local contest. Real writers don't peak at 13. The trophy ended up in the back of my closet. I never showed her my writing again. I was 17 watching Sarah, then 14, squeal with delight as she opened her birthday present to find car keys. An actual car paid for entirely by our mother with insurance covered for a year. When my 17th birthday had come 3 months earlier, I'd received a card with a $20 bill inside and a note saying, "You're practically an adult now, time to be independent." I'd taken the bus to my part-time job at the library and never said a word about the disparity. I was 25 when our father died suddenly of a heart attack. Margaret had called me, her voice cold and businesslike. "Your father passed away this morning. I'm too distraught to handle the arrangements. You'll need to take care of it." I'd organized everything: the funeral home, the service, the burial, the reception. Sarah had texted the day before the funeral saying she couldn't make it. She had a work commitment she couldn't cancel. Margaret had attended but left early, claiming emotional exhaustion. I'd stood at the graveside with a handful of Dad's old colleagues, burying my father essentially alone. The pattern was so clear now, looking back. I'd spent 35 years trying to earn love from people constitutionally incapable of giving it. And I'd taught myself to minimize my needs, to accept crumbs, to type "no worries" when everything was very much not okay. But Oscar had never accepted it. "Mom," he'd said to me just a few months ago after a particularly painful family dinner where Margaret had criticized everything from my career choice to my parenting style, "Why do you let them talk to you like that? You're amazing. You shouldn't let them make you feel small." I'd brushed it off, made excuses about complicated family dynamics, told him he didn't understand. But he'd understood perfectly. He'd seen what I'd refused to see, that I was choosing to accept their treatment by not fighting back. And then there were his questions in those last few weeks before camp. "Mom, what exactly does Grandma's foundation do? And how much money do they raise? And doesn't it seem weird that she's always asking for donations, but I never see any of the kids they're supposed to be helping?" I'd been distracted, busy with a project deadline, and I'd told him not to worry about adult things. But what if he'd been onto something? What if there was more to his death than a tragic accident? The camp had told me he fell during a nighttime activity, hit his head on rocks, and died before help arrived. But Oscar was coordinated, careful. And what nighttime activity? He'd never mentioned anything like that in our calls. My coffee had gone cold. I was staring into the forest, but I was seeing something else entirely. A pattern, a possibility, a horrifying question mark, where I'd accepted a period. That's when I heard it. A knock at the cabin door. My entire body went rigid. No one knew I was here. No one knew this place existed. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Ms. Winters," a male voice called. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about your son." I froze on the porch, my heart hammering. The voice came again, calm but insistent. "Ms. Winters, I'm not here to upset you. I just need 5 minutes of your time. It's about Oscar." My son's name in a stranger's mouth made my stomach clench. I moved toward the door, then hesitated. Through the window, I could see the shadow of someone standing on the porch, but I couldn't make out details. My hand reached for the doorknob, then stopped. That's when I noticed a cream-colored envelope tucked partially under the doormat, one corner visible. It hadn't been there when I'd arrived in the middle of the night, I was certain of that, which meant someone had placed it here recently, perhaps the person now standing on my porch. "I'm leaving something for you," the voice called out. "Read it when you're ready. I'll be at Miller's Cafe on Route 9 every morning at 10. I hope you'll come." I heard footsteps on the wooden stairs, then the sound of a car engine starting. I waited a full 5 minutes listening as the vehicle drove away down the mountain road before I opened the door and retrieved the envelope. Inside was a business card, simple and professional. Robert Hayes, Private Investigator, Retired. Below the printed text was a handwritten note in neat, careful script. "I've been waiting to talk to you about your son. I believe you deserve answers. Meet me at Miller's Cafe on Route 9 when you're ready. I'll be there every morning at 10 a.m. I read it 3 times, my mind racing. A private investigator, looking into Oscar's death. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. Part of me wanted to crumple the card and throw it away to reject the possibility that there was anything to investigate, that Oscar's death was anything other than a horrible accident. But a louder part of me, the part that had been whispering questions since I woke up this morning, the part that remembered Oscar's worried face when we video chatted, needed to know more. How had this Robert Hayes found me here? How did he even know about this cabin? And more importantly, what had he discovered about Oscar's death that made him track down a grieving mother in her secret hideaway? I barely slept that night. I kept reading the note, studying the business card, playing out scenarios in my mind. By the time dawn broke, I'd made my decision. I needed answers more than I needed safety or comfort, or the cocoon of ignorance. Miller's Cafe turned out to be exactly the kind of place the name suggested, a small roadside diner with cracked vinyl booths, a laminate counter that had seen better decades, and the persistent smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. It was just past 10 when I pushed through the door, a bell jingling overhead to announce my arrival. I spotted him immediately. He sat in a corner booth, a man in his late 50s with silver hair, a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors or under stress, and eyes that looked kind despite, or perhaps because of whatever suffering they'd witnessed. When he saw me, he didn't wave or smile. He simply nodded, acknowledging my arrival with the gravity the situation deserved. I slid into the booth across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. "Ms. Winters," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming. I'm Robert Hayes." "How did you find me?" I asked, skipping pleasantries. "I'm an investigator. It's what I do." His voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "I found property records in your name. I took a chance that you might be there." "And how do you know about Oscar?" Instead of answering directly, he slid a manila folder across the table. "I've been working child welfare and endangerment cases for 20 years. I specialize in situations where children are harmed by the adults who should be protecting them. When I saw the report about your son's death, something didn't sit right with me." I stared at the folder but didn't open it yet. "What do you mean?" "There are irregularities, details that don't add up, witness statements that conflict with each other, a timeline that makes no sense." He paused, studying my face. "I think someone covered something up." The words hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to reject them outright, to defend the camp, to insist that no one would be so evil as to cover up a child's death. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I'd been thinking the same thing. With trembling hands, I opened the folder. The first document was the official incident report from the camp. I'd seen a copy of this before, but I'd been too devastated to read it carefully. Now, with Robert guiding me through it, I saw what he meant. "According to this report," Robert said, pointing to a specific paragraph, "Oscar fell during a nighttime team-building activity near the hiking trail at approximately 9:45 p.m. He hit his head on rocks and was found unresponsive by a counselor 20 minutes later." I nodded. "That's what they told me. Here's the problem. Robert pulled out another document, a printed copy of the camp's official schedule. There was no nighttime activity scheduled for that evening. The schedule shows all campers were supposed to be in their cabins by 8:30 for quiet time before lights out at 9. My breath caught. Maybe it was a spontaneous thing, an unscheduled activity. Possible, but unlikely. Summer camps don't do spontaneous nighttime activities for liability reasons. And if they did, there would be multiple counselors present and incident reports documenting it. He pulled out another sheet. These are statements from 3 different staff members who were on duty that night. Read them. I scanned the statements. One counselor said Oscar was found on the hiking trail. Another said he was near the equipment shed. A third mentioned the area behind the dining hall. My hands started shaking harder. The location of the fall doesn't match across statements, Robert continued. And the timing is off too. One says 9:45, another says 10:15, the third says around 10 but wasn't sure. These people were either not paying attention or someone told them to give statements without comparing notes first. Someone coached them, I whispered. Someone coached them poorly, Robert corrected. In my experience, when powerful people try to cover something up, they usually do it better than this. This reads like panic and hurry. I looked up at him, my vision blurring with tears that were equal parts grief and rage. Why would anyone cover up how my son died? That's what I'm trying to find out. His expression was sympathetic, but determined. I've seen this pattern before, Ms. Winters. Powerful people, charitable organizations, money changing hands, and a child who ends up dead with a death that's rushed through as accidental. The authorities want to close the case quickly because investigating means looking into uncomfortable places, but you deserve the truth. Who are you really? I asked. Why do you care about this? Something flickered in his eyes. Old pain, old regret. Let's just say I failed to help someone once in a similar situation. I'm not going to fail again. He reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. This was taken 2 days before Oscar died. I obtained it from another camper's parent. The kids were taking pictures throughout the week. He slid it across the table and I found myself staring at my son's face. Oscar was standing outside what looked like the camp's administration building, and he appeared to be talking to a man I'd never seen before, middle-aged, expensive suit, slicked back hair. But it was what the man was wearing that made my blood run cold. Around his neck was a distinctive silver Celtic knot pendant on a thick chain. I knew that necklace. I'd seen it 1,000 times. It belonged to my mother. My hand trembled so violently that the photograph shook. I set it down on the table, afraid I'd drop it, and pressed my palms flat against the cool surface to steady myself. That necklace, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know that necklace. Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression alert but patient. Tell me. It's my mother's. She's worn it every single day for as long as I can remember. I couldn't take my eyes off the image, off that distinctive Celtic knot pattern catching the sunlight in the photograph. She inherited it from her mother. My grandmother died when I was 5. Margaret always said it was her most precious possession, that it represented the only good thing her mother ever gave her. She never takes it off. Not to shower, not to sleep. I've never seen her without it. Are you certain it's the same piece? Robert asked. Celtic designs can be similar. I shook my head firmly. No, this is distinctive. See that small chip on the left side of the knot. My grandmother dropped it once and Margaret had it repaired but kept the chip as a reminder of imperfection or something. And the chain that's custom thicker than standard because Margaret wanted something that felt substantial. This is definitely hers. Robert made a note in a small notebook he'd pulled from his jacket. So the question becomes, why would your mother's most precious possession be around a stranger's neck? And why would that stranger be meeting privately with your son 2 days before he died? The implications crashed over me like a wave. I felt dizzy, disoriented. I don't understand. Why would she give it to him? She wouldn't. She just wouldn't. Maybe she didn't give it to him, Robert suggested quietly. Maybe she loaned it to him. as a sign of trust or authority, something to show Oscar that this man was legitimate, that he represented the family somehow. The idea made me feel sick. You think she sent him to talk to Oscar? I think it's a possibility we need to explore. Robert tapped the photograph. Look at your son's posture here. What do you see? I forced myself to really examine the image to see past the shock of the necklace and focus on Oscar himself. He was standing with his shoulders slightly hunched forward, his hands clasped together at his waist in that anxious gesture he'd had since he was little. His head was tilted down just slightly, but his eyes were looking up at the man, a submissive posture, respectful but wary. He's uncomfortable, I said. Yes, but notice what he's not doing. He's not crying. He's not trying to leave. His body language isn't fearful, it's confused, uncertain. Robert pointed to Oscar's hands. See how he's gripping his own fingers. That's self-soothing behavior, but it's mild. This is a child who doesn't understand the situation but is trying to be polite about it. I remembered Oscar's voice on our last video call, the one 3 days before he died. He'd seemed distracted, kept looking away from the camera. When I'd asked if something was wrong, he'd said, "It's probably nothing, Mom, just some weird adult stuff I don't get." I'd been in the middle of a design project deadline and had told him we'd talk more later, that he should focus on having fun at camp. God, I'd dismissed him. I'd been too busy to hear what he was trying to tell me. The timestamp says this was taken at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, Robert continued. I checked the camp schedule. That's during free time when kids could choose between activities or rest in their cabins. So Oscar wasn't pulled out of a scheduled event. Someone likely told him to go meet this man, made it seem normal or necessary. Who would do that? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Someone Oscar trusted. Someone whose authority he wouldn't question. Robert's eyes were steady on mine. Camp staff, possibly. Or someone from home who had called the camp to arrange it. Margaret. He was talking about Margaret. I thought about my mother's charity foundation, the one she'd built over the past 8 years and never stopped talking about. She was always hosting fundraisers, collecting donations, posting photos of herself with grateful families. The foundation ran several programs, including my stomach-dropped summer enrichment camps for children from low-income families. Oscar's camp had been one of those programs. Margaret had recommended it, had even helped with the application. It'll look excellent on his future college applications, she'd said. And it's free, the foundation covers everything. I'd been grateful at the time, touched that my mother was taking an interest in her grandson's future. What if it hadn't been generosity? What if it had been something else entirely? Robert, I said slowly, my mother runs a charitable foundation. It provides scholarships and programs for kids, including summer camps. Oscar's camp was one of hers. Robert's expression didn't change, but I saw something flash in his eyes, recognition, or perhaps confirmation of something he'd already suspected. The Winters Family Foundation, he said. It wasn't a question. You already knew. I suspected. I've been researching your family since I started looking into Oscar's death. He pulled another sheet from the folder, a printout of my mother's foundation website, showing her smiling beside a group of children. Tell me about the foundation, how it operates, where the money comes from. I don't really know the details, I admitted. Margaret never involved me. She'd mention it at family dinners, talk about fundraisers and donation goals, show us photos of events. But the actual operations, the finances, I never saw any of that. Did Oscar ever mention anything unusual about the program? Anything that struck you as odd? I racked my brain going back through our conversations before camp. He asked me a few questions about how charities work, how much money they raise, where it goes. I thought he was just being curious, trying to understand Grandma's work. My voice cracked. He asked if it seemed weird that the foundation was always asking for money, but he never saw any of the kids they were supposedly helping. I told him not to worry about adult things. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, I need to ask you something difficult, Ms. Winters. Is there any chance your mother had reason to interact with your son in ways you weren't aware of? Any possibility that Oscar had access to information about the foundation that he shouldn't have seen? Before I could answer, Robert reached into the folder again. There's something else you need to see. He pulled out another photograph and placed it on the table beside the first one. This image showed the same man, same expensive suit, same slicked-back hair, same Celtic necklace glinting in the light, but he wasn't at a camp. He was standing in what looked like an upscale restaurant, and beside him, leaning in close as if sharing a confidence, was my sister Sarah. The timestamp on this photo was 3 weeks before Oscar's death. I stared at the photograph of Sarah and the unknown man, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The image was clear. They were seated across from each other at a restaurant I recognized as Bellini's, an upscale Italian place downtown that Sarah had mentioned going to for business lunches. She was leaning forward, her elbows on the table in a posture of intense engagement. The man was gesturing with one hand, his expression serious. This wasn't two acquaintances making small talk. This was a meeting with purpose. When was this taken? I asked, though the timestamp was clearly visible in the corner. 3 weeks before Oscar died, Robert confirmed. A colleague of mine works security at the building next door. When I showed him the man's photo, he remembered seeing him multiple times over the past few months, always meeting with the same woman. He pulled archived footage and found this. My hands had gone numb. Sarah told me she didn't know anything about the program. When I mentioned that Mom had recommended Oscar's summer camp, I asked Sarah if she knew any details about it. She said she'd never heard of it before and didn't know anyone involved. She lied, Robert said simply. The word hung between us like an accusation. I wanted to defend my sister, to find some innocent explanation. Maybe this man worked in her industry. Maybe they'd met coincidentally. Maybe the photo was misleading. But even as I formed these excuses in my mind, I knew they were hollow. Sarah had explicitly denied any knowledge of the program or its staff. This photograph proved otherwise. The restaurant is 5 blocks from Sarah's office. Robert continued, pulling out a map with the locations marked. And my contact says he saw them meeting there at least 4 times over a 2-month period, always on Thursday afternoons around 2 p.m. That suggests regular scheduled meetings, not chance encounters. I felt the foundation of my understanding crack further. First my mother's necklace, now my sister's secret meetings. The family I'd spent my whole life trying to belong to was revealing itself to be something I didn't recognize at all. There's more, Robert said, and I wasn't sure I could handle more. He slid another document across the table, a bank statement with several lines highlighted in yellow. I have a contact who was able to obtain financial records. These are transfers from your mother's account to your sister's account. I scanned the highlighted entries. 3 separate wire transfers, each for $5,000, spaced about 3 weeks apart. The memo line on each simply said, "Family assistance." The dates made my stomach turn. The first transfer was dated 2 days after Oscar had been accepted into the summer program. The second came a month later. The third was exactly 1 week before Oscar died. $15,000 over 2 months, Robert said. Labeled as family assistance, but the timing is notable. Did your sister need financial help during this period? Was she going through any hardship? No, I said, my voice hollow. Sarah has a good job in marketing. She makes more than I do. And Mom's always been generous with her anyway. She bought Sarah a condo as a 30th birthday present 2 years ago. Sarah doesn't need family assistance. Robert nodded as if this confirmed his suspicions. Now, look at these transactions from Sarah's account. He pointed to another set of highlighted entries. 2 wire transfers going out of Sarah's account, one for $3,000 and another for $5,000. Both were made to something called Brightside Educational Services, LLC. The dates fell between the transfers from Margaret. What's Brightside Educational Services? I asked, though dread was already forming in my gut. It's a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a state known for opaque business registration laws. It took some digging, but I traced it. Brightside Educational Services is a subsidiary of the Winters Family Foundation. It's the entity that directly operates the summer programs, including the one Oscar attended. The diner suddenly felt too small, too hot. Sarah was paying money to the organization that ran Oscar's camp. $8,000 total, Robert confirmed. Money she received from your mother, then funneled to the foundation's operational arm. The question is, why? What was she paying for? I couldn't answer. My mind was spinning through possibilities, none of them good. Was this a donation? But why would Sarah donate money she'd just received from Margaret? Why not have Margaret donate directly? Unless the money wasn't supposed to be traceable back to Margaret. Unless it was payment for something specific, something that needed to appear to come from a different source. Sarah's always been competitive with me, I said slowly, trying to make sense of the senseless. Ever since we were kids. Mom favored her, gave her everything, but Sarah always seemed resentful that I had Oscar. She made these comments, sometimes little digs about single motherhood or how I'd limited my potential by having a child young, but I never thought. I couldn't finish the sentence because the thought was too monstrous to speak aloud. Robert's voice was gentle but firm. Ms. Winter's jealousy isn't always about what someone has. Sometimes it's about what they can't control. Your mother could give your sister money property status, but she couldn't make you love Sarah more than you loved your son. She couldn't manufacture the bond you had with Oscar. That kind of relationship can't be bought or transferred. He was right. For all of Margaret's favoritism towards Sarah, for all the material advantages my sister had received, there was one thing Sarah had never been able to claim: she wasn't the center of someone's universe the way Oscar had been the center of mine. My love for my son had been absolute, uncomplicated, and unshakable. In that one aspect of life, I'd had something Sarah couldn't touch. The thought made me feel sick. Could Sarah have been that petty, that cruel? Could she have done something to hurt Oscar because she resented my relationship with him? I need you to prepare yourself, Robert said, his tone shifting to something heavier. There's one more document. My whole body tensed. What is it? He pulled out a final sheet, another bank record, this one from Sarah's account. A single transaction was highlighted, dated just over a week ago. One day after Oscar's death. It was a wire transfer for $10,000 sent directly to an individual account. The recipient's name was listed, Daniel Reeves. Who is Daniel Reeves? I whispered. Robert tapped the earlier photograph of the mysterious man wearing my mother's necklace. That's his name, Daniel Reeves. I identified him yesterday. He's your mother's former business partner and the co-founder of the Winters Family Foundation. The room tilted. Sarah had sent $10,000 to this man the day after my son died. Not a week later, not a month later. The very next day. Why would she? I started, but my voice failed. Robert's expression was grim. That's what we need to find out. But in my experience, Ms. Winters, when someone makes a large payment immediately following a death, it's usually for one of two reasons. Either they're paying for a service that was rendered, or they're buying someone's silence. I left Miller's Cafe with Robert's words echoing in my mind. You need to go back. They can't know you suspect anything. We need more evidence, and the only way to get it is from the inside. He'd given me a small audio recorder disguised as a button, shown me how to activate it with a simple twist. Wear this every day, he'd said. Document everything. Every conversation, every slip they make. We're building a case and we need them to incriminate themselves. So 3 days after I'd disappeared, I drove back to my mother's house in the suburbs, the sprawling colonial where I'd grown up, where I'd never quite belonged, and where I was currently staying because I had nowhere else to go. At least that's what they thought. They didn't know about the cabin. They didn't know about Robert. They didn't know that the daughter who'd always been so easy to manage was now playing a completely different game. I pulled into the driveway just after 6 p.m., deliberately choosing the time when I knew they'd both be home. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, steadier than they'd been in days. I was no longer the woman who'd collapsed at the airport. I was someone else now, someone harder and more focused. But they couldn't see that version of me. Not yet. I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders, and shuffled toward the front door like someone barely holding herself together. Margaret opened it before I could use my key. She stood in the doorway, perfectly coiffed as always, wearing a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Behind her, I could see Sarah hovering in the hallway, her expression a mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite read. "Where have you been?" Margaret demanded, though her tone tried for worried and landed closer to annoyed. "We've been calling you for days. Your phone went straight to voicemail." "I needed time alone," I said, keeping my voice hollow and defeated. "I'm sorry I worried you." I watched their faces carefully, saw the subtle relaxation in Margaret's jaw, the way Sarah's shoulders dropped slightly. They thought they were getting their Rachel back, the compliant one, the manageable one. Come in," Margaret said, stepping aside. "You look terrible. Have you been eating?" I walked past her into the familiar space. The pristine white furniture, the carefully curated art on the walls, the fresh flowers on the entry table that were replaced every 3 days like clockwork. Everything in this house was controlled, orchestrated, perfect on the surface. "I'll make tea," Margaret announced, already moving toward the kitchen. "Sarah, help your sister with her things." Sarah approached me with hesitant steps. "Rachel, we saw you on the news. That thing at the airport? Are you okay?" "I don't really remember it," I lied smoothly. "It's all kind of a blur." "Well, it was very brave," Sarah said, but her eyes were searching my face for something. "But also kind of concerning, the way you just inserted yourself into that situation. Mom and I have been talking, and we think maybe you should see someone, a professional, to help you process everything." There it was. Less than 5 minutes back in the house, and they were already laying the groundwork to paint me as unstable. "Maybe you're right," I said softly, making sure to sound uncertain, fragile. "I haven't been feeling like myself." I saw the look that passed between them, satisfaction mixed with relief. They thought they were managing me, controlling the narrative. Margaret returned with tea on a silver tray, another one of her performance pieces. She poured with practiced elegance, handed me a cup, and settled into her usual chair like a queen on a throne. "Rachel, darling, we need to discuss some practical matters." She began, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she wanted to seem caring, but was actually issuing directives. "This outburst at the airport, the hospital stay, your disappearance, these are signs that you're not coping well. Sarah and I think it would be best if you stayed here where we can keep an eye on you, just until you're more stable. Keep an eye on me. Control me. Make sure I don't do anything they can't manage." "That's probably a good idea," I agreed meekly. "I don't think I should be alone right now." The relief on their faces was palpable. They actually thought this was going to be easy. "And perhaps," Margaret continued delicately, "it would be best if you took a break from social media, from talking to reporters, if any contact you about the airport incident. You're grieving, you're vulnerable. We wouldn't want you to say something you'd regret later." Translation: Don't talk to anyone. Don't share your story. Let us control what the world knows. "Of course," I murmured, taking a sip of tea I had no intention of drinking. Who knew what they might put in it? Later that afternoon, after I'd retreated to my room, the same childhood bedroom that had never quite felt like mine, I heard Margaret on the phone in her study down the hall. Her door wasn't fully closed, and her voice carried. "Yes, she's back and seems manageable," she was saying. "No, I don't think she suspects anything. She's too wrapped up in grief to think clearly." A pause. "The investigator, I'm having it looked into, but I don't think he has anything solid. And even if he did, who would believe him over us?" Another pause, then a cold laugh. "Rachel's always been easy to discredit. We just need to keep her close and contained until this all blows over." I stood frozen in the hallway, my fingernails digging into my palms. The audio recorder button on my cardigan had captured every word. The next morning, I woke early and went outside to take out the trash, a normal domestic task that wouldn't raise suspicion. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd lived next door for as long as I could remember, was tending her garden. When she saw me, her expression shifted to one of deep sympathy. "Rachel, dear," she called softly, glancing toward my mother's house, as if checking whether we were being watched. "I'm so terribly sorry about Oscar. What a beautiful boy he was." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," I said, my throat tightening. Of all the people in my life, this neighbor I barely knew was showing more genuine compassion than my own family. She hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I feel I should tell you something. Your mother has been talking to some of the neighbors. She's been saying that you've been unstable since Oscar's death, that you might be dangerous to yourself or even others. She asked us to call her if we notice you behaving strangely." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Did she?" "I don't believe a word of it," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "I've known you since you were a little girl. You've always been the sane one in that family, if you ask me. I just thought you should know what she's doing." "Thank you," I managed. "I appreciate you telling me." As I walked back to the house, I understood exactly what Margaret was doing. She was systematically destroying my credibility before I even had a chance to speak. If I came forward with accusations, with suspicions, with questions about Oscar's death, she'd already planted the seeds of doubt. People would think I was a grieving mother who'd lost her grip on reality. It was preemptive character assassination, and it was brilliant in its cruelty. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Around 11, I heard voices low and urgent coming from downstairs. I crept out of my room and moved silently down the hallway, years of practice helping me avoid the creaky floorboards. The voices were coming from Margaret's study. The door was closed but not latched, leaving a sliver of space. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. "You need to calm down," Margaret was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Panicking helps nothing." "Calm down." Sarah's voice was high and strained. "Mom, we can't let her find out. If she starts asking questions, if she talks to the wrong people." "She won't. I've already taken steps to ensure her credibility is questionable." "But what about the investigator? What if he keeps digging?" "I'm handling it," Margaret snapped. "Daniel is taking care of loose ends." A long silence. Then Sarah again, quieter. "It's too late to fix this, isn't it? What you did," Margaret interrupted coldly. "I warned you about getting involved directly. I told you to let Daniel handle everything." "You're the one who—" Sarah's voice broke off. "God, if that investigator finds out about the money, about the foundation, about what really happened that night." "He won't," Margaret said with certainty that made my blood run cold. "Because we're going to make sure Rachel is far too busy dealing with her own mental health crisis to help him." My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they'd hear it. I had to get back to my room, had to process what I'd just heard. As quietly as I'd come, I retreated down the hallway and closed my bedroom door with trembling hands. They knew. They knew about Robert. They were actively working to stop the investigation. And whatever had happened to Oscar, whatever had happened that night, they were both involved. I pulled out my phone and texted Robert. "They know about you, and they're planning something." I barely slept that night, lying in the darkness with my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for Robert's response. When it finally came at 6 a.m, it was brief. "Be careful. Don't let them know you suspect anything. Meeting tomorrow, same place, 10 a.m. I spent the day playing my role perfectly, the grieving mother too shattered to function properly. I stayed in my room, mostly emerging only for meals where I picked at food and responded to questions in monosyllables. Margaret watched me with satisfaction. Sarah seemed nervous, fidgeting constantly, but neither of them gave any indication they suspected I was anything other than what I appeared to be. That evening, after a silent dinner where Margaret talked about some upcoming charity event, as if my son hadn't just died, I retreated upstairs early. I told them I was tired, that I wanted to try to sleep. Margaret nodded approvingly and reminded me she'd made an appointment with a psychiatrist for me next week. "Just to help you process everything, dear," she said with false warmth. I closed my bedroom door, then waited. Around 10 p.m., when the house had settled into silence, I heard it again. Voices from Margaret's study. low and urgent, the same tense quality as the night before. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding the recording device already activated. This time I positioned myself more carefully, finding a spot where I could hear clearly but remain hidden if someone opened the door suddenly. The study door was open just a crack, and through it voices carried with crystal clarity. Margaret was speaking, her voice sharp with anger. "I told you to handle it quietly. You promised me the boy would just forget what he saw and move on. How did it escalate to this?" "I tried." Sarah's voice was defensive, almost whining. "I did exactly what you said. I went to the camp, I talked to him privately. I told him it was just complicated adult business that he didn't understand." And clearly, that wasn't enough. Margaret's tone was ice. "Because now we have an investigation and a dead child." The casual way she said, "dead child," as if Oscar was an inconvenient problem rather than her grandson, made my stomach turn. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. "He was too smart, Mom," Sarah said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Just like Rachel. He kept asking questions. He wanted to know why the numbers didn't match, why the foundation was raising so much money, but only a few kids were in the programs. He'd taken pictures of the documents he found. He said he was going to show them to Rachel when he got home." Documents. Oscar had found documents. That's what this was about, evidence of something in Margaret's foundation, something they couldn't afford to have exposed. "What exactly did you tell him?" Margaret demanded. Sarah's voice broke slightly. "When I went to see him at the camp, he looked so scared. He asked me if you were in trouble, if Rachel would be hurt if this got out. He was worried about his mother, about protecting her." She gave a bitter laugh. "That's the irony, isn't it? He was trying to protect Rachel and I. I told him that if he talked about what he saw, it would destroy the family. That it would destroy you, destroy everything we'd built. That Rachel would be devastated to learn what he'd discovered." I felt tears streaming down my face. Oscar had been trying to protect me. My baby had found something wrong and wanted to tell me, but they'd used his love for me as a weapon against him. "I thought he'd understand," Sarah continued. "I thought I was protecting us, protecting the foundation, protecting our reputation. I told him we'd fix it quietly if he just gave us time. But he wouldn't listen. He said lying was wrong, that hiding bad things was wrong. He sounded just like Rachel with all that moral certainty." "You were protecting yourself," Margaret said coldly. "Let's not pretend this was some noble family loyalty. You knew if the embezzlement came out, you'd be implicated too. All those consulting fees you've been collecting, all the money I've funneled through your accounts, you're in this as deep as I am." Embezzlement. The word hung in the air like a confession. My mother had been stealing from her own charity, and Sarah had been helping her. "And now," Sarah asked, her voice small, "what do we do now?" "We manage the situation," Margaret said with the cold practicality that had always defined her. "First, we deal with this investigator. I've made some calls. Robert Hayes used to be legitimate, but he retired under questionable circumstances, something about becoming too emotionally involved in cases. We can use that. If he starts making accusations, we paint him as an obsessed has-been chasing conspiracies." "But what if Rachel hired him?" Sarah asked nervously. Margaret actually laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Rachel? She doesn't have the spine for something like that. She's probably drowning in grief and denial right now, just like she always does when life gets hard. Remember when her husband left? She barely functioned for months. This is worse. She's not capable of orchestrating an investigation." The contempt in her voice was familiar. I'd heard variations of it my entire life. But this time, instead of making me feel small, it made me feel powerful. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "But we need to be careful," Margaret continued. "I've already started laying groundwork with the neighbors, planting seeds that Rachel is unstable. If she does start making accusations, no one will believe her. And we keep her here where we can monitor her. The psychiatrist I'm sending her to is an old friend. He'll diagnose whatever I need him to diagnose." "What about Daniel?" Sarah asked. "He's the one who was actually there when it happened." "Daniel will keep his mouth shut," Margaret said firmly. "I've made sure of that. The payment you sent him should be more than enough to secure his silence. And if it's not, I have other leverage." My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly gasped aloud. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking, terrified the sound had been audible. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. The words made my blood run cold. "Stop recording. We know you're listening." I stared at the text message, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Stop recording. We know you're listening." But I hadn't been recording. The device was in my pocket, not activated, unless they'd seen me standing outside the study door, unless there were cameras in the hallway, unless they'd been watching me this whole time. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately. Robert's voice echoed in my memory from our last meeting. "The moment they try to intimidate you is the moment you know you're getting close. Don't panic. That's what they want. They want you scared and reactive." I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Moving as naturally as I could manage, I walked away from the study and back toward my bedroom. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my pace normal, unhurried. Inside my room, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. The text had come from an unknown number, which meant it was likely from a burner phone untraceable. It could be a bluff, a shot in the dark to see if I'd react. Or it could be confirmation that they had surveillance I didn't know about. Either way, I couldn't let them see me rattled. I opened my messages and typed carefully. "Need to reschedule our coffee. Something came up." It was the code phrase Robert and I had established for situations exactly like this. He'd understand that the situation had escalated, that we needed to meet somewhere completely secure. His response came within minutes. "Tomorrow, different location. We'll text details in AM." I deleted both messages, then powered down my phone completely. If they were monitoring my communications, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the darkness, every sound in the house making my nerves spike. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, pausing outside my door. I kept my breathing steady and even, pretending to be asleep. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated. When morning came, I knew exactly what I had to do. I dragged myself downstairs around 9, deliberately not bothering to brush my hair or change out of the wrinkled t-shirt I'd slept in. I wanted to look like someone who'd given up, someone who was drowning in grief and barely functional. Margaret was already in the kitchen, perfectly dressed as always, drinking coffee and reading something on her tablet. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the assessment in her eyes cataloging my appearance, my posture, my energy level. "Good morning, dear," she said with practiced concern. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not really," I mumbled, pouring coffee with shaking hands. I let some spill on the counter, didn't bother to clean it up. "Why don't you sit down?" Margaret guided me to a chair like I was fragile. "I've been thinking. Maybe you shouldn't be alone so much. Perhaps you should spend more time down here with us rather than isolating yourself upstairs." Translation: "We want to keep you where we can watch you." "Okay," I said dully. Sarah appeared a few minutes later, already dressed for work. She took one look at me and exchanged a glance with Margaret, satisfaction mixed with relief. I could read their thoughts clearly. This is the Rachel we know. Broken. Manageable. "I think you made the right decision about seeing Dr. Morrison," Sarah said, pouring herself coffee. "He's supposed to be excellent with grief counseling." Dr. Morrison, Margaret's friend who would diagnose whatever she wanted him to diagnose. "I just want to feel normal again," I said, my voice cracking authentically. The grief was real after all. I just wasn't going to let it paralyze me the way they expected. I spent the rest of the morning in the living room staring blankly at a morning show I wasn't watching. I let my coffee go cold on the side table. When Margaret asked if I wanted lunch, I barely responded. Sarah called during her lunch break to check on me, and I kept my answers brief and lifeless. All the while, the recording device hidden in the button of my cardigan was documenting every word spoken in this house. Margaret made a phone call in the afternoon, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. Yes, she's completely compliant today. I think the text last night did the job. She's been like a ghost all morning. A pause. No, I really don't think she's capable of coordinating anything. She can barely function. When Sarah made a comment about how I needed to start moving forward and thinking about the future, I just nodded vaguely. When Margaret suggested again that I should talk to a professional, I agreed, meekly playing the part of someone too exhausted to resist. But behind my dull eyes, my mind was working, calculating, planning. That afternoon, while Margaret was at one of her charity meetings and Sarah was at work, I conducted a thorough but careful search of my bedroom. I'd been in enough detective dramas to know what to look for, anything with a small lens, anything positioned to have a clear view of the room. I found the first camera inside a decorative picture frame on the dresser, angled perfectly toward my bed. The second was in the smoke detector on the ceiling. Both were small, professional grade, the kind that transmitted wirelessly. My own family was spying on me. For a moment, fury threatened to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. But then, I thought about what Robert would say. Use everything as a weapon. Turn their tactics against them. I didn't remove the cameras. Instead, I left them exactly where they were. That evening, I sat on my bed in clear view of both cameras and made a phone call. I'd programmed Robert's voicemail into my phone under the name Grief Support Helpline, and now I called it, letting it ring through. "Hello?" I said, my voice broken and trembling. "Yes, I called the helpline earlier. I just need someone to talk to." I paused as if listening. "I don't know how to move forward. My son died and I feel so lost. My family keeps saying I need to accept it and move on, but I can't. I just want to forget everything, stop thinking about it all the time." Another pause. "You're right. Maybe forgetting is the only way to survive this. Maybe I should just let go and stop asking questions." I talked for 20 minutes, creating a narrative of someone who was giving up, who wanted to escape into denial rather than face reality. Everything Margaret and Sarah wanted to hear. When I finally ended the call, I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing they were watching, knowing they'd feel satisfied that their plan was working. What they didn't know was that every word I'd just spoken was an act. I wasn't giving up. I was giving them exactly what they needed to become complacent. My phone buzzed with the text from an unknown number. "Millers Creek Park, North Entrance, 11 a.m. Come alone." I deleted it immediately, but not before memorizing the details. 20 minutes later, my actual phone, the one Margaret and Sarah knew about, rang. It was Robert, but this time he wasn't being subtle. "Ms. Winters," he said, his voice urgent. "I've traced the financial transactions. Every single one leads back to your mother's charity foundation. And what I've found..." He paused. "You need to see this immediately. The embezzlement is more extensive than I thought. We're talking about nearly $2 million over 8 years. And Oscar's camp was part of it. He found proof." I met Robert the next morning at Millers Creek Park, a sprawling public space with enough foot traffic to blend in, but enough open areas to spot if anyone was following. I'd driven a deliberately circuitous route, doubling back twice to make sure I wasn't being tailed. Robert was already waiting on a bench near the north entrance, a folder on his lap and 2 coffee cups beside him. "You look terrible," he said as I sat down. "I'm playing a part," I replied. "They need to think I'm falling apart." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded with what looked like approval. "You're getting good at this. Here." He handed me one of the coffees. "You'll need this for what I'm about to show you." He opened the folder and I saw immediately why he'd insisted on meeting. The documents inside were extensive bank statements, tax filings, internal foundation records, donor lists, expense reports. It looked like the contents of an entire filing cabinet. "Where did you get all this?" I asked. "Let's just say your mother's foundation has some employees who are increasingly uncomfortable with what they've been seeing," Robert said diplomatically. When I started asking questions, one of them decided their conscience was worth more than their paycheck. He spread several documents across the bench between us, pointing to highlighted sections as he spoke. Your mother's charity, the Winters Family Foundation, has been operating for 8 years. On the surface, it looks completely legitimate: glossy brochures, professional website testimonials from grateful families, annual galas with local celebrities. She's raised approximately $2 million in that time. $2 million, I whispered. Yes. And according to the foundation's marketing materials, 85% of all donations go directly to program costs, scholarships, summer camps, educational materials. That's what donors are told. That's what gets the foundation its tax-exempt status and community support. He pulled out a different set of documents. But here's what actually happens. What he showed me made my stomach turn. Detailed accounting records revealed that of every dollar donated, only about 20 cents actually reached any program that helped children. The rest disappeared into a maze of inflated expenses and questionable transfers. See this? Robert pointed to a line item showing a payment of $15,000 for administrative consulting. This went to a shell company registered in Delaware. When you trace that company's ownership, it leads back to an LLC that your mother controls. She's essentially paying herself consulting fees with donor money. He showed me page after page of similar transactions. Facility rentals that cost 3 times the market rate, with the excess going to companies Margaret owned. Supply purchases that were wildly overpriced. Marketing expenses that somehow required $50,000 for a simple email campaign. Every legitimate expense was inflated, and the difference was funneled into accounts Margaret controlled. Over 8 years, she's embezzled approximately $1.9 million, Robert said quietly. And the summer program Oscar attended was part of this scheme. My hands were shaking as I took the documents from him. How did Oscar find out? Robert pulled out another set of papers, what looked like camp schedules and activity logs. The camp assigned Oscar to help organize a fundraising event during the program's final week. It was supposed to be a leadership development opportunity, teaching the kids about event planning and community engagement. Oscar was asked to help set up a display table showing the foundation's impact. They let a 12-year-old handle foundation documents? I asked incredulously. They sent him to retrieve donor acknowledgement letters from a filing cabinet in the camp director's office. What they didn't realize is that Oscar was curious and thorough, traits he got from you, I'm guessing. While he was in that office, he found other documents mixed in with the letters. Financial records that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone, let alone a child. Robert showed me photocopies of invoices. These are duplicates of what Oscar found. Look at this one. The foundation paid $50,000 for facility rental of the camp for a week-long session. But when you check the actual contract the camp has with the foundation, the real cost was $8,000. The difference, $42,000, went to an LLC called Brightside Educational Services. The same company Sarah was sending money to, I said, remembering the bank records from our earlier meeting. Exactly. Brightside is owned by your mother and Daniel Reeves jointly. They were pocketing the difference between what donors thought programs cost and what they actually cost. I thought about Oscar, my brilliant, principled son, finding these documents and trying to make sense of them. He took pictures, didn't he? Yes, we found the original images in his cloud backup. He used his tablet to photograph 6 different invoices showing similar discrepancies. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at. He was 12, but he knew something was wrong. And he knew who to tell. Me, I whispered. You. According to his video diary entry from that night, he planned to show you the photos when he got home. He wanted your advice on what to do. Robert's expression was pained. He was trying to do the right thing, but somehow Margaret found out. How? I demanded. Robert pulled out another document, a printed calendar with handwritten notes. This is from Margaret's personal assistant at the foundation. The assistant was concerned enough about some irregularities that she kept copies of Margaret's schedule. 2 days after Oscar found those documents, Margaret made an unscheduled trip to the summer camp. She told the assistant it was a routine quality check, but that was unusual. She'd never visited any program site unannounced before. I stared at the date circled on the calendar. It matched the timestamp on the photograph Robert had shown me Oscar talking to the man wearing Margaret's necklace. Daniel Reeves went with her, Robert continued. He's the co-founder of the foundation and Margaret's former business partner. They both show up at the camp the same day, and that evening, he pulled out a camp incident log. Someone breaks into Oscar's cabin. His tablet is taken from his backpack, and when it's returned the next morning, all the photos he'd taken of the financial documents are deleted. They stole his tablet and erased the evidence, I said, my voice hollow. They tried to, but Oscar was smarter than they realized. He'd already set up automatic cloud backup. Every photo he took was uploaded to his account automatically. When they erased his tablet, they thought they'd eliminated the problem. They had no idea the evidence still existed. I felt tears streaming down my face. They terrified him. They broke into his space, stole his things, made him feel unsafe. All to hide their crimes. Yes, and based on what you overheard them saying, Sarah went to see him after that, tried to convince him to stay quiet. Used his love for you as leverage, made him think telling the truth would hurt you. I wanted to scream. I wanted to destroy something, but I forced myself to stay focused. What happened the night he died? I'm still piecing that together, Robert admitted. But I have a working theory. Oscar wouldn't let it go. Despite being frightened, despite Sarah's manipulation, he was determined to tell you. So Margaret and Daniel panicked. They arranged another meeting with him, probably trying one last time to silence him. And something went wrong. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your mother is home, now. I looked at Robert in alarm. I need to go. They'll notice if I'm gone too long. Then, take these, he said, quickly, organizing copies of the most damaging documents into a smaller folder. Hide them somewhere safe. And Rachel, be careful. They're getting desperate. I drove back faster than I should have, my mind racing. When I pulled into the driveway, Margaret's car was there, which was unusual for mid-morning. She usually spent Wednesdays at the foundation office. I let myself into the house quietly and immediately smelled something wrong. Smoke. My heart leapt into my throat. I followed the acrid scent to Margaret's study, and when I pushed open the door, I found her kneeling in front of the fireplace, feeding papers into flames that crackled and roared. She spun around at the sound of the door, her face pale, her hands full of documents. We stared at each other for a frozen moment. Then she said, her voice remarkably steady. Rachel, I didn't know you were home. What are you doing? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral, confused rather than accusatory. Margaret straightened slightly, though she didn't release the stack of papers clutched in her hands. Just clearing out old paperwork, she said, but her voice was too high, too tight. Spring cleaning. You know how these things pile up. But I could see the documents in her hands weren't old at all. The letterhead was crisp fresh, the Winters Family Foundation logo clearly visible on the top sheet before she fed it into the flames. I watched the paper curl and blacken, saw fragments of financial tables and signature lines consumed by fire. That's a lot of paperwork, I observed mildly. Do you need help? No. The word came out sharp, almost panicked. Margaret took a breath, visibly trying to compose herself. No, dear. This is private foundation business. Nothing for you to worry about. Why don't you go rest? You look tired. She was trying to usher me out, her body positioning itself between me and the fireplace as if she could block my view of what she was destroying. But it was too late. I'd already seen enough. Okay, I said softly, obediently. I think I will lie down for a bit. I left the study and closed the door behind me, then stood in the hallway listening. I heard the rustle of more papers, the crackle of flames, and underneath it all a sound that might have been Margaret crying or might have been something like a laugh, the sound of someone unraveling. I went to my room and texted Robert immediately. She's burning documents, foundation letterhead, financial records, she's panicking. His response came within seconds. Don't interfere, let her finish. We have copies of most of it already. Her destroying evidence only helps prove consciousness of guilt. An hour later, I heard Margaret's footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of the front door closing. I waited 5 minutes to be sure she was gone, then crept back to the study. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, and the room reeked of smoke and burned paper. I pulled on a pair of gardening gloves I'd retrieved from the garage Robert had taught me about preserving evidence, about not leaving fingerprints or contaminating anything that might be used in court. Most of what remained in the fireplace was ash black and fragile, disintegrating at the slightest touch. But Margaret had been in such a hurry, so frantic, that some pieces hadn't burned completely. I carefully sifted through the debris looking for anything salvageable. Most of it was two damaged corners of pages with partial words, fragments of charts with numbers obscured by char. But then I found it wedged against the grate where it had escaped the worst of the flames, a partial document, maybe a third of the original page, singed brown at the edges but still readable. It was a bank transfer authorization form. Margaret's signature was clearly visible at the bottom, along with a date stamp from 1 week before Oscar died. The transfer amount, $25,000, was partially obscured, but legible. The recipient field showed Daniel Reeves' personal account, but it was the memo line that made my hands shake. Final payment, project closure. Project closure. The week before my son died. I photographed the fragment from multiple angles with my phone, making sure every detail was captured, then carefully placed it in a plastic bag I'd brought with me. Even partially burned, this was evidence. This was proof of a payment to Daniel Reeves, timed precisely with Oscar's death, described in language that made it sound like the completion of a task. I texted the photos to Robert with a single message, "Found this in the ashes." His response came quickly. "Get out of that room, now, and hide that document somewhere she'll never find it." I sealed the plastic bag and tucked it inside the lining of my winter coat in the back of my closet, then returned the gardening gloves to the garage. By the time Margaret came home 2 hours later, I was in the living room staring blankly at the television like I'd been there all afternoon. Over the next 3 days, I watched my mother fall apart. She was on the phone, constantly, always speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I'd hear her pacing in her bedroom late at night, her voice rising and falling in agitation. She barely ate. I'd find full plates of food abandoned in the kitchen. Her usually immaculate appearance started to slip. She wore the same outfit 2 days in a row. Her makeup wasn't as perfect. Sarah noticed, too. She came by Thursday evening, and I heard them arguing in Margaret's study. "You need to pull yourself together," Sarah hissed. "People are noticing. Mrs. Chen asked me if you were feeling well." "I can't sleep," Margaret said, and I heard genuine fear in her voice. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that investigator's face. I keep thinking about what he might have found, what he might know." "We just need to hold it together a little longer," Sarah insisted. "The death certificate is being processed. Once it's finalized and the case is officially closed, the investigator will have nothing to work with. He can't investigate what's been legally settled as an accident." "You don't understand," Margaret said, and now she was crying. I pressed my ear closer to the door, barely breathing. "It's not just about Oscar. If they start digging into the foundation, if they find the offshore accounts, if they trace all the transfers over the years, Sarah, we're talking about nearly $2 million. That's serious prison time." "No one's going to prison," Sarah said, but she sounded uncertain. "We covered our tracks. The money's been moved through enough accounts that—" "What if Daniel talks?" Margaret interrupted. "What if he decides to save himself by throwing us under the bus? I paid him to handle the Oscar situation, and now that boy is dead. If Daniel tells them that if he shows them the payments—" "He won't," Sarah said firmly. "You paid him enough to ensure his silence. And if he talks, he incriminates himself too. He has just as much to lose as we do." "Does he?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "He can claim he was just following orders, that I coerced him. He can make a deal with prosecutors. I've seen it happen. The person at the top always falls hardest." There was a long silence, then Sarah said quietly, "What about Rachel? Do you think she suspects anything?" Rachel. Margaret's voice held contempt. Look at her. She can barely function. She sits in front of the television all day staring at nothing. She's broken just like I knew she would be. She doesn't have the strength or the intelligence to piece any of this together. I stood in the hallway listening to my mother dismiss me as weak and stupid, and I felt something cold and hard settle deeper in my chest. Let them think I was broken. Let them believe their own lies. Every word they spoke was being recorded. Every mistake they made was bringing me closer to the truth. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I slipped away from the door and checked the message. It was from Robert, emergency. We found Oscar's cloud backup. He recorded video diaries. You need to see this now. I made an excuse about needing fresh air and drove to the location Robert texted me, a coffee shop parking lot 30 minutes outside the city, far from anywhere Margaret or Sarah would think to look. Robert was waiting in his car, a laptop open on the passenger seat. When I slid into the vehicle beside him, I saw my hands were shaking. Are you ready for this? He asked gently. Seeing him, hearing his voice, it's going to be hard. I need to see it, I said. I need to know what he knew. Robert turned the laptop toward me, his finger hovering over the play button. There are 3 videos. He recorded them over the course of 3 weeks. The cloud backup was automatic. He probably didn't even realize they were being saved. When Margaret and Daniel erased his tablet, they had no idea these existed. He pressed play, and suddenly Oscar's face filled the screen. My breath caught in my throat. There he was, my beautiful boy, alive and whole, sitting in what looked like his camp cabin with sunlight streaming through the window behind him. He was wearing his favorite blue t-shirt, the one with the faded logo from that science museum we'd visited 2 years ago. His hair was messy, sticking up in the back the way it always did. He looked so young, so earnest. Hi, Mom, he said, and the sound of his voice broke something inside me. I'm making these videos just in case something happens, or in case I need to remember exactly what I saw. I know that sounds weird, but I want to get this right. He glanced down at something off-screen, then back at the camera. So Mr. Reeves came to talk to me today. He's the man who helps run Grandma's foundation. He said Grandma wanted me to understand the family business since I'm getting older and might want to be involved someday. He showed me some papers, financial reports, I think. He was trying to explain how the foundation works. Oscar's expression shifted, became more troubled. But Mom, the numbers didn't make sense. The report said the foundation spent $200,000 on scholarships this year, but I counted all the kids in my program and there are only 15 of us. And I heard the camp director say our tuition is $3,000 each. That's only $45,000 total. So where did the other $155,000 go? He bit his lip, a gesture I recognized from when he was working through a difficult problem. I took pictures of the papers with my tablet. I wanted to show you when I get home in case I'm not understanding this right. But something feels wrong about it. The math doesn't work. The video ended and I realized I was crying silently, tears streaming down my face. Robert waited, giving me a moment, then said quietly, "There are 2 more." He started the second video. This one was dated a week later, and Oscar looked different, more worried, less certain. He was filming in what appeared to be the bathroom, his voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Mom, I think I made a mistake," he began, and I heard the fear in his voice. I asked Grandma about the numbers when she called to check on me. I thought maybe she could explain what I was missing, but she got really angry, like scary angry. She said I misunderstood what I saw and that I should never, ever mention it to anyone again. She said I was too young to understand complicated business matters. He looked down, then back at the camera. But then today, Aunt Sarah showed up at camp. She said it was a surprise visit, but Mom, she seemed really nervous. She took me aside and said we needed to talk about what I'd found. She said if I told anyone about those papers, it would destroy our family, that Grandma could lose everything, that you would be devastated. My chest tightened. They'd used me. They'd weaponized my son's love for me to keep him quiet. She made me promise not to tell you. Oscar continued, his voice cracking slightly. She said it would hurt you too much, that you'd be crushed to learn what I'd discovered. I don't know what to do, Mom. I don't want to hurt you. But I also know that lying is wrong. You always taught me that. And I think Grandma and Aunt Sarah are lying about where the money goes." He wiped his eyes quickly. "I'm scared, but I'm going to figure out the right thing to do. I love you." The video cut off, and I couldn't breathe. My son had been terrified, manipulated, torn between his love for me and his sense of right and wrong, and I hadn't been there. I hadn't known. "Rachel," Robert said softly, "there's one more." The third video was dated the day before Oscar died. In this one, Oscar looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red and he spoke in a flat, resigned tone that was so unlike him it made my heart ache. "I told Mr. Reeves today that I was going to tell you everything when I got home from camp," he said. "I couldn't keep lying to you, Mom. I couldn't pretend I didn't know." He got really quiet, and then he said that would be very disappointing. He said Grandma would be forced to take action if I did that. I asked him what that meant, and he just smiled and said I should think very carefully about my choices. Oscar's hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the camera. "I'm scared, Mom. Really scared. But you always taught me to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, even when people try to make you feel like you're wrong. Tonight there's supposed to be a special campfire, and Mr. Reeves said he wants to talk to me privately afterward. I'm going to record the conversation on my phone just in case." He took a deep breath, and I saw him trying to be brave, trying to summon courage he shouldn't have needed at 12 years old. "Mom, if you're watching this, it means something happened. I'm sorry if I messed up. I'm sorry if I made things harder for you. I just wanted to do the right thing. You're the best mom in the world, and you taught me that truth matters more than comfort. I hope I'm making you proud." He reached toward the camera, and the video ended. I sat in Robert's car, shaking with sobs I couldn't control. My son had known he was in danger. He'd been brave anyway. He'd tried to do the right thing, tried to expose the truth, and they'd killed him for it. "I'm going to destroy them," I said through my tears. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did." Robert's expression was grim. "There's something else you need to know. Oscar said he was going to record his conversation with Daniel Reeves on his phone that night. But his phone was never recovered from the scene. The camp claims they never found it. It's missing." I looked at him, understanding dawning. "They took it. Whoever was with him when he died took his phone." "Yes. Which means there's a recording out there somewhere, evidence of what really happened that night. And they're desperate to make sure it never surfaces." After watching Oscar's videos, I couldn't go back to Margaret's house immediately. I sat in Robert's car for another 20 minutes trying to compose myself enough to drive to put the mask back on. Robert waited patiently, occasionally handing me tissues, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming since the videos ended. If Oscar's phone was never found, how do we prove what happened? "We build the case piece by piece," Robert said. "The phone would be definitive evidence, but it's not the only evidence. I've been working another angle." He pulled out a different folder, this one containing what looked like official camp documents. "I contacted the summer camp administration 2 weeks ago, presenting myself as a family representative conducting a private review of Oscar's death. I asked for a complete inventory of his belongings, everything that was packed up from his cabin and returned to you." I nodded. "They sent me a box. His clothes, some books, his sketch pad." "Right. But when I cross-referenced what they sent you with the packing list Oscar's cabin counselor made on the first day of camp, something was missing." He showed me 2 lists side by side. "Oscar checked in with a smartphone, it's listed right here, but it's not on the list of items returned to you." I stared at the discrepancy. I assumed he had it with him when it happened. That maybe it was damaged in the fall. That's what the camp wants you to think. When I pressed them about it, they claimed they never found a phone at the scene or in his cabin. They suggested maybe he'd lost it earlier in the week or left it somewhere. Robert's expression was skeptical. But Oscar's last video diary was recorded the day before his death. He clearly had the phone then. And based on everything you've told me about him, he was responsible with his belongings. "He was," I confirmed. He saved his allowance for 6 months to buy that phone. He treated it like gold. Exactly. So the phone didn't just disappear. Someone took it. And the most likely scenario is that it was taken from the scene that night by whoever was with Oscar when he died. Because it contained a recording, I said, the pieces falling into place. He said he was going to record his conversation with Daniel Reeves. Yes. And that recording would prove Oscar didn't just wander off and fall accidentally. It would show there was a confrontation, that someone else was there. Robert pulled out another set of documents. I've been doing my own investigation, interviewing people who were at the camp that night. Staff, other campers, anyone who might have seen something. He showed me handwritten notes compiled from multiple interviews. Oscar was seen leaving the dining hall around 8 p.m. with Daniel Reeves. Multiple witnesses confirm this. They walked toward the campfire area together. One counselor said Oscar looked nervous but compliant, like he'd been told to go with Reeves and was obeying. My hands clenched into fists. They lured him away from the other kids. It appears so. Around 8:30, a counselor doing rounds heard voices coming from near the hiking trail, one adult, one child. She said the adult voice sounded angry. The child's voice sounded upset. She considered checking on it, but then the voices moved away and she got distracted by another camper needing help. She heard them arguing, I whispered. At 9 p.m., a different witness, one of the kitchen staff taking out trash, heard what she described as raised voices from the same direction. She specifically remembered because one voice was clearly a child's, and she wondered why a kid was out there that late. Robert's jaw tightened. Then at 9:45, Daniel Reeves was seen returning to the main camp area alone. Multiple witnesses noted he looked disheveled. His shirt was untucked, his hair messy, and he appeared agitated. He went straight to his car and left the property without speaking to anyone. I felt sick. And Oscar's body wasn't discovered until 11 p.m. when a counselor doing final bed checks realized he was missing and organized a search. They found him near a rocky overlook about a quarter mile from the main camp. Robert paused. The official report says he fell while wandering alone in the dark. But Daniel Reeves was the last person to see him alive, I said. And he left immediately afterward, looking upset. Yes, and no one questioned this. No one asked why a 12-year-old boy was out on a hiking trail at night, or why Daniel Reeves had taken him there, or why Reeves left without reporting anything unusual. Robert's frustration was evident. The camp director called it a tragic accident. The local sheriff agreed. Case closed within 48 hours. He pulled out one more document, a medical examiner's report with several sections highlighted. I have a contact in the ME's office. He was able to get me not just the official report, but the examiner's private notes observations that weren't included in the final version. I scanned the highlighted sections, my medical knowledge limited but sufficient to understand the implications. The official cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head consistent with a fall from height. But the ME's notes told a different story. The injury pattern suggests he fell backward, not forward, Robert explained, pointing to a specific paragraph. If Oscar had been walking and tripped, he would have fallen forward, tried to catch himself. The injuries would be on his hands, knees, front of his body, but the trauma is primarily to the back of his head and shoulders. Like he was pushed, I said, my voice hollow, or stumbled backward during a confrontation. And look here, Robert indicated another section. Minor bruising on both upper arms consistent with being grabbed or restrained. The ME noted these injuries were likely sustained shortly before death. Someone grabbed him. The ME recommended further investigation. He specifically noted inconsistencies that warranted additional scrutiny. But somehow the sheriff's department closed the case anyway, ruling it accidental. Robert met my eyes. I did some checking. Your mother's foundation has made significant donations to local law enforcement charities over the years. She has relationships with several people in that department. The implication was clear. Margaret had used her influence to shut down any real investigation into Oscar's death. She'd made sure it was ruled an accident quickly before anyone could ask too many questions. We can prove this, I said, All of this, the witnesses, the medical evidence, the missing phone, the financial motive. We can prove they killed him. We're building toward that, Robert agreed. But we need more. We need Daniel Reeves to talk, or we need that phone, or we need... My own phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting him. I pulled it out and saw a text from Margaret. "Where are you?" "You've been gone for hours." I showed it to Robert. I need to get back before she gets more suspicious. The next 2 days passed in agonizing slowness. I continued playing my role at Margaret's house, appearing broken and compliant, while watching my mother and sister with new eyes. Every word they spoke, every glance they exchanged, felt loaded with guilt. On the 3rd day, a package arrived. I was alone in the house when the doorbell rang. The delivery person handed me a padded envelope with no return address, just my name printed on a label. I signed for it and waited until I was back in my room before opening it. Inside was a cheap burner phone, the kind you can buy at any convenience store with cash and no ID. It was already powered on. As I stared at it, the screen lit up with a single text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk about what really happened that night. Come alone. Dr. Daniel Reeves." The man who'd been with my son when he died was reaching out to me. I stared at the burner phone for a long time, Daniel Reeves's message glowing on the screen. Every instinct told me to respond, to demand answers, to finally hear the truth about what happened to Oscar that night. But I forced myself to think strategically. I texted Robert a photo of the message. His response came within minutes. "Do not respond. Do not meet him. This is either a trap or he's trying to manipulate you. Let me handle this." He was right. Daniel Reeves wasn't reaching out because he suddenly developed a conscience. He was scared, probably pressured by Margaret to assess how much I knew, or to lure me into a situation they could control. I powered off the burner phone and hid it in my closet with the other evidence I'd been collecting. But if Daniel was feeling enough pressure to reach out to me, that meant the walls were closing in on all of them. And if there was one person in this house who might crack under that pressure, it was Sarah. I found her the next evening in the kitchen alone for once. Margaret had gone to some charity board meeting, probably another opportunity to perform her role as the grieving grandmother, while secretly panicking about her crumbling empire. Sarah was making tea, her movements jerky and anxious. She'd been like this for days, jumpy, distracted, constantly checking her phone. I closed the kitchen door behind me and leaned against it, blocking the exit. Sarah looked up, and something in my expression made her freeze. "Rachel, what's wrong?" I dropped the facade I'd been maintaining for weeks. My voice came out cold, steady, nothing like the broken woman I'd been pretending to be. "I know about the money transfers. I know you were meeting with Daniel Reeves. I know you went to Oscar's camp and threatened him." The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. I wasn't." She stopped, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't lie to me anymore. I have bank records showing Mom transferred $15,000 to you, and you turned around and sent $8,000 to the foundation. I have photographs of you meeting with Daniel Reeves at Bellini's. I know you went to the camp and told Oscar to keep his mouth shut about what he'd found." Sarah's teacup slipped from her hands and shattered on the tile floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up. "I didn't threaten him." The words burst out of her, defensive and panicked. "I was trying to protect—" She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she'd just admitted. "Protect who?" I demanded, moving closer. "Mom, yourself, because you certainly weren't protecting a 12-year-old boy who'd discovered his own grandmother was stealing from children." "You don't understand," Sarah said, and now tears were streaming down her face. "You don't understand what it's like." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Explain how you could look my son in the eye and manipulate him into silence. Explain the money. Explain all of it." Sarah sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her whole body shaking. "You've always thought being Mom's favorite was some kind of privilege. You've resented me for it your whole life. But Rachel, it's a cage. It's a prison." I said nothing, just waited. "Every single decision I make, she controls. Sarah continued, her voice breaking. When I was 25, I met someone. Tom. He was kind, funny, everything I wanted. I thought I was going to marry him, but Mom said he wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't from the right kind of family. She said if I married him, she'd cut me off, that I'd be making the biggest mistake of my life. So I broke up with him. That was your choice, I said, but my voice was less harsh now. Was it? Sarah laughed bitterly. 2 years later, I got offered an amazing job in Seattle. Great salary, room for advancement. I was so excited. And Mom said, family stays close. If you move across the country, you're choosing yourself over us. She made me feel so guilty, like wanting my own life was a betrayal. So I turned it down. She wiped her eyes with trembling hands. Every job I've had since has been through her connections. My condo. She bought it, but the deed is in her name. My car leased through one of her companies. I'm 33 years old and I can't pay for anything without her involvement. She's made me financially dependent on her, emotionally dependent. I thought about my own life, the struggles, the hard years after Oscar's father left, the constant financial worry. But I'd been free. I'd made my own choices, built my own life, answered to no one but myself and my son. Sarah had been gilded in chains. When Mom told me we had a problem with Oscar, Sarah continued, she made it sound like family loyalty, like protecting what we'd built. She said Oscar had found some financial documents and was asking questions that could destroy everything. She said I needed to help manage the situation. Manage the situation, I repeated. That's what you call manipulating a child. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah's voice rose to almost a shout. She said if I didn't help her, she'd cut me off completely. Financially, emotionally, everything. She said I'd end up alone and struggling just like you. That's what she said, just like Rachel. Like being you was the worst possible fate. The words stung, but I pushed past the pain. So what did you do? I met with Daniel Reeves, multiple times. Mom said he was experienced in handling delicate situations, that he'd talk to Oscar and make him understand it was complicated adult business. She made it sound like we were just going to have a conversation with him, clear up his confusion. And the money. Sarah's face crumpled. Mom transferred money to me and told me to pay Daniel. She said it couldn't come directly from her, that it needed to look like a separate transaction. I didn't question it. I just did what she told me, like I always do. You gave Daniel Reeves money to silence my son. I gave him money to talk to Oscar. Sarah insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I swear I thought it was just going to be a conversation. Mom said Daniel was good with kids, that he'd handle it gently. I didn't think anyone would get hurt. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to something dangerous. But Oscar did get hurt. He died, Sarah, and you paid the man who was with him when it happened. I didn't know. Sarah was sobbing now. I didn't know what was going to happen. When Mom called me that night and said there'd been an accident, I thought I wanted to believe it was really just an accident. But then she told me what I needed to say, if anyone asked how I needed to describe my visit to the camp, what story we were all telling. And I realized... You realized you'd helped them murder him. No, Sarah's voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to. Oscar wasn't supposed to. She couldn't finish the sentence. I pulled out my phone and held it up so she could see the recording app that had been running the entire conversation. You're going to tell the police everything you just told me. Every meeting with Daniel Reeves, every dollar Mom transferred, every lie you told to cover this up. Sarah stared at the phone, then at me, her face a mask of terror. She'll destroy me. If I testify against her, she'll make sure I lose everything. You've already lost everything, I said. Your integrity, your soul, any claim to being a decent human being. At least this way you can tell the truth. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then she whispered, If you're recording this, there's something else you need to know. Mom has been planning something. Yesterday she told me Rachel won't be a problem much longer. I asked her what she meant, and she just smiled and said she'd taken care of it. My blood ran cold. What does that mean? I don't know, Sarah said, genuine fear in her eyes now. But Rachel, whatever she's planning, it's happening soon. The moment Sarah said those words, cold terror flooded through me. I didn't wait. I didn't pack. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and the folder of documents hidden in my closet, and I was out the door before Sarah could say another word. I drove without thinking, pure survival instinct taking over. 3 blocks away, I pulled over and texted Robert, "Red alert." "Where are you?" came his immediate response. "Driving, away from the house. Sarah just warned me Margaret is planning something. Said I won't be a problem much longer. Meet me at the Riverside Motel on Highway 44, room 7. I'm leaving now." 20 minutes later, I pulled into the motel parking lot with shaking hands. Robert was already there, standing outside one of the rooms, his expression grim. The moment I stepped out of my car, he said, "We're getting you out of that house. Tonight. No discussion." "I can't just disappear." I started, but he cut me off. "Yes, you can, and you will." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Rachel, I've worked cases like this for 2 decades. When desperate people feel cornered, they escalate. Your mother has already stolen nearly $2 million and covered up a child's death. What do you think she's willing to do to protect herself from prison?" The question hung in the air, and I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I had an answer I didn't want to acknowledge. "I've called in a favor with a former colleague at the sheriff's department," Robert continued. "He's going to have patrol cars increase their presence in this area, but you can't go back to that house, not until we have her in custody." "What about my things? What things matter more than your life?" He gestured toward the motel room. "I've already checked you in under a different name. You'll stay here while we finalize the case against her." I wanted to argue, to insist I could handle myself, but the truth was I felt utterly vulnerable. I nodded and followed him inside. The room was basic but clean. Robert set his laptop on the small desk and turned to me. "I need to check your car. Stay here." He was gone for 15 minutes. When he returned, he was holding a small black device in a plastic evidence bag. "GPS tracker," he said, setting it on the desk. "Professional grade, magnetically attached to your wheel well. Someone's been monitoring every move you make." My stomach dropped. "How long has it been there?" "Hard to say without a full analysis, but based on the battery level, I'd guess at least a week. Maybe longer." He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. I need you to run a check on something." He rattled off what sounded like serial numbers from the device, then waited. After a moment, his expression darkened. "I see. Thanks." He ended the call and looked at me. "That tracker was purchased by a private security firm that Margaret's foundation has used in the past. She's been watching you, Rachel. Probably since the moment you came back from the cabin." The violation felt overwhelming. Every trip to meet Robert, every moment I'd thought I was being careful, she'd known about all of it. "There's more," Robert said quietly. He pulled up something on his laptop. "My contact at the sheriff's department did some checking at my request. Your mother made inquiries 3 days ago about the process for emergency psychiatric holds in this county. Specifically, she asked about having an adult family member involuntarily committed for evaluation." I felt the blood drain from my face. "She's going to have me locked up." "She's laying the groundwork for it, yes. And there's this." He showed me a report. "She also attempted to access your bank account yesterday. She called your bank claiming to be you said she'd lost her debit card and needed to freeze the account. They flagged it as suspicious because the phone number didn't match their records, but she tried." Margaret was systematically trying to isolate me, control me, eliminate me as a threat. She was cutting off my mobility, my money, my credibility, and potentially my freedom. "She's done this before," I said, the realization hitting me. "The neighbors. The psychiatrist appointment. The way she's been talking about me being unstable. She's been building a narrative." "Exactly," Robert confirmed. "So that when she makes her move, whatever that move is, everyone will believe you're having a mental breakdown rather than exposing the truth." I sank onto the bed, feeling the full weight of what I was up against. "Why are you doing this?" I asked suddenly. "Why are you risking so much to help me?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. He sat in the desk chair and looked at his hands before meeting my eyes. 5 years ago, I worked a case involving charity embezzlement. A man was running a veterans support organization collecting donations, giving almost nothing to actual veterans. His 14-year-old daughter was helping him with bookkeeping one summer and discovered the fraud. She came to me scared but determined to do the right thing. His voice grew heavy. I told her I needed time to build a solid case, that she should act normal and not let her father know she'd talked to me. 2 weeks later, she was dead, ruled a suicide, pills and alcohol. But I never believed it. That girl was smart, motivated, planning to go to college. She had everything to live for. What happened? I asked softly. The people running that scheme had connections, money, power. The investigation into her death was perfunctory. Case closed. Her father got away with it, and that girl's family never got justice. He looked at me with eyes full of old pain. I failed her, Rachel. I told her to wait, to be patient, and she died waiting. When I saw your son's case, the same patterns, the same type of people I knew, I couldn't let it happen again. Before I could respond, Robert's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his expression turned to stone. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the phone so I could see the news alert. Local philanthropist Margaret Winters files emergency petition for guardianship of daughter citing mental health crisis following grandson's death. I stared at the news alert on Robert's phone, reading the words over and over as if repetition would make them less real. Emergency guardianship petition. Mental health crisis. Erratic and delusional behavior. Margaret was using the legal system as a weapon, trying to lock me away before I could expose her. "We fight back," Robert said firmly. "I'm calling Michelle Torres right now." "Who?" "Family law attorney. She specializes in fighting exactly this kind of abuse of the guardianship system. If anyone can stop your mother, it's Michelle." Within an hour, Michelle Torres was sitting across from me in the motel room, and I understood immediately why Robert trusted her. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit despite the late hour, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and an energy that felt like barely contained fury. She read through Margaret's petition with increasing disgust, occasionally making notes in margins or muttering Spanish phrases I didn't understand, but that sounded decidedly uncomplimentary. "This is textbook," she finally said, looking up at me. "Textbook abuser behavior. Isolate the victim, control the narrative, use the legal system as a weapon. Your mother is trying to have you declared incompetent so she can control your finances, your movements, your ability to testify against her." "Can she do that?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Michelle's smile was sharp. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm filing an immediate counterpetition tonight. We're going to attach statements from everyone who can attest to your mental competency and your mother's pattern of manipulation." "I don't have a therapist," I started, but Michelle held up her hand. "You started seeing Dr. Patricia Moore 2 weeks after Oscar's death. Robert told me. I've already called her with your permission. She's willing to provide a statement that you've been processing your grief in a healthy, rational manner and show no signs of the instability your mother is claiming." I blinked. I didn't realize Robert knew about Dr. Moore. "I make it my business to know everything that could help my clients," Robert said from his position by the window. "Dr. Moore is legitimate, well-respected, and her testimony will carry weight." Michelle continued. "We'll also include a character statement from Robert, testimony from your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, about your mother's campaign to discredit you, and statements from anyone else who can speak to your state of mind. By the time we're done, the judge will see this petition for exactly what it is, a desperate attempt to silence you." She worked through the night, her laptop glowing in the dim motel room, typing furiously and making phone calls to other attorneys, to court clerks, to anyone who could help expedite our response. I watched her work and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The next morning, Robert brought different news. "Detective Gonzalez wants to meet with you." Detective Maria Gonzalez turned out to be a woman in her early 50s with gray-streaked hair and the calm, assessing manner of someone who'd seen every type of criminal behavior. We met at a coffee shop far from Margaret's neighborhood, and she laid out a folder of documents that looked disturbingly similar to the evidence Robert had been compiling. "I've been reviewing the material Mr. Hayes provided," she said without preamble. "There's enough here to open a formal investigation into your mother's foundation for embezzlement and into the circumstances surrounding your son's death for potential obstruction of justice and child endangerment." My heart leapt. "You believe us." "I believe the evidence," she corrected, but not unkindly. "However, opening an official investigation is a delicate matter. If your mother gets wind that law enforcement is involved, she might destroy evidence, flee, or escalate in other ways. We need to time this carefully." She pulled out a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. "I've been coordinating with the district attorney's office. They're interested in building cases for embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, and possibly charges related to your son's death. But they want the case to be airtight before we make any moves." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything you have, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. We're building a timeline that connects your mother's financial crimes to the pressure put on your son to the events of the night he died." She looked at me intently. "And I need you to be prepared for what comes next. When we move on this, it's going to be very public. Your family's secrets will be exposed. Are you ready for that?" I thought about Oscar, about his video diaries, about his determination to do the right thing even when he was terrified. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Over the next 2 days, something unexpected happened. Word about Margaret's guardianship petition had spread through the community, probably through Mrs. Chen and the neighborhood network, and people started reaching out to me. First came a woman named Jennifer Reeves, who'd worked as an accountant for the foundation 3 years ago. She contacted me through Robert and provided copies of emails she'd kept showing Margaret, explicitly instructing her to inflate expense reports and redirect funds to personal accounts. "I quit because I couldn't be part of it anymore," Jennifer said. "But I kept the emails just in case. I'm ready to testify." Then came parents of children who'd participated in foundation programs. They shared stories of poor supervision, inflated costs that didn't match the quality of programming, and concerns they'd been too intimidated to voice, while Margaret held power over their children's opportunities. But the most significant contact came from a man named Gerald Hutchins, a former board member of the foundation. He'd resigned 6 months ago over philosophical differences, which apparently meant he'd discovered Margaret's fraud and she'd forced him out before he could expose it. "I have internal emails going back 5 years," Gerald told me when we met at Michelle's office. "Communications where Margaret discusses moving money between accounts, paying herself consulting fees, using foundation resources for personal expenses. I documented everything before I left because I knew someday someone would need it." "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. His expression was pained. "I tried. I filed a report with the State Charity Oversight Board. Somehow it disappeared. Margaret has connections everywhere in law enforcement and government, in the legal system. I was one person against her entire network. But now you've got Robert, you've got Detective Gonzalez, you've got an attorney. Maybe together we can actually take her down." Each person who came forward felt like another piece of armor, another layer of protection. Margaret had built her empire on the assumption that people were too afraid to speak against her. But that empire was crumbling. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. the following morning. Michelle assured me we were ready, that Margaret's petition would be denied. But I couldn't sleep that night, lying in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, running through everything that could go wrong. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door. I froze, then crept to the window and peered through the curtain. Sarah stood outside in the rain, mascara running down her face, looking utterly destroyed. "Rachel," she called softly. "Please, I need to talk to you. Please let me in." I stood at the door for a long moment, my hand on the knob, warring with myself. Every instinct told me not to trust Sarah, that this could be another manipulation, another trap. But the woman standing in the rain looked nothing like the polished, composed sister I'd known my whole life. She looked broken. I called Robert first. Sarah's here, at my door. Should I let her in? Put me on speakerphone, he said immediately. Don't be alone with her. I'm recording this call. Whatever she says, I'll have it. I opened the door. Sarah stumbled inside, soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face, makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for letting me in. Robert's on speakerphone, I said, setting my phone on the desk. Whatever you say, he's hearing it. Sarah nodded, seeming to barely register the information. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her whole body shaking. I can't do this anymore. I can't live with this anymore. With what? I asked, though I already knew. All of it. The lying, the guilt, the fear. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. Mom called me today. She told me that if I even think about testifying against her, she'll make sure I go to prison too. That she'll paint me as the mastermind behind everything that she'll say I manipulated her into covering for me. She said she has enough documentation to make it believable. And you're surprised? I kept my voice cold. You've watched her manipulate people our entire lives. I know, Sarah said miserably. I know what she is. But Rachel, I've been in her prison my whole life. You got out. You built your own life, had Oscar, made your own choices. I've never been free. Every decision I make, she controls. And I'm so tired of it. I sat in the chair across from her, maintaining distance. Then tell me the truth. All of it. What really happened to Oscar? Sarah took a shuddering breath. That night, the night Oscar died, I was at home. Around 10 p.m., Mom's phone rang. I was in the living room and I heard her answer it. She went into her study and closed the door, but I could hear her voice getting louder, more agitated. When she came out, she was pale. She said she had to go handle something at the foundation, and she'd be back in a few hours. She went to the camp, I said. Yes, but I didn't know that then. She didn't come home until almost 2 a.m. When she did, she sat me down and told me there'd been an accident. That Oscar had fallen during a nighttime walk and he was dead. She was so calm, Rachel, so eerily calm, like she was discussing a business problem, not the death of her grandson. My hands clenched into fists, but I said nothing. She told me that Daniel Reeves had called her in a panic. He'd been trying to talk to Oscar about the financial documents Oscar had found. He was trying to convince Oscar to forget what he'd seen to understand it was complicated adult business. But Oscar refused. Because my son had integrity, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Yes, Sarah whispered. Oscar told Daniel he was going to tell you everything when he got home from camp, that he didn't care what happened to the family, that lying was wrong. Daniel got frustrated, scared. He knew if Oscar exposed the embezzlement, he'd go to prison, so he grabbed Oscar's arm, trying to physically prevent him from leaving. I felt sick. And Oscar pulled away, hard. He stumbled backward toward the rocky overlook. Daniel said it happened so fast, Oscar lost his footing and fell before Daniel could grab him again. Sarah's voice dropped to barely audible. Daniel claimed it was an accident, that he never meant for Oscar to get hurt. But instead of calling for help, instead of calling 911, he called Mom. Because he knew she'd cover it up, I said. Sarah nodded. Mom drove to the camp immediately. She got there in under 30 minutes. By the time she arrived, Oscar was already... She couldn't finish the sentence. Mom told me she and Daniel staged the scene. They made it look like Oscar had wandered out there alone, like he'd fallen while walking by himself. They removed his phone because it had the recording Oscar had made of his conversation with Daniel. And you helped them, I said flatly. Not that night. I didn't know any of this until after. But yes, later I helped. Sarah was crying openly now. Mom called me the next morning and told me the story I needed to tell if anyone asked. She said I'd spoken to her on the phone that evening around 9 p.m. that we'd discussed foundation business. She made me practice it until it sounded natural. When the police asked me to provide a statement about Mom's whereabouts, I lied. I gave her an alibi. You helped her get away with killing my son. I told myself it was an accident, Sarah said desperately. I told myself Daniel didn't mean for it to happen, that Mom was just protecting the family from scandal. But I knew. Deep down, I knew they'd let him die to protect themselves. They prioritized covering their tracks over saving a 12-year-old boy. I stood up, needing distance from her. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't carry it anymore. Because you deserve to know the truth. Because... She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Because I've been recording Mom's conversations for the past week, and you need to hear what she's been saying. I froze. You've been recording her? Every conversation. I started after she threatened me. I was scared, and I thought if I had evidence of her threatening me, maybe I could protect myself. But what I got was so much worse. She looked at Robert's phone on the desk, knowing he was listening. I have her admitting to the cover-up, to paying Daniel to keep quiet, to planning to have Rachel committed so she can't testify. Everything. Play them! Robert's voice came through the speaker tight with controlled excitement. Sarah's hands shook as she opened her phone and selected the first recording. Sarah's phone speaker crackled slightly as the first recording began to play. Margaret's voice filled the motel room, clear and unmistakable, and I felt my entire body tense at the sound. The boy is dead. The boy is... Margaret's tone was matter-of-fact, discussing Oscar's death like a minor business setback. It's unfortunate, but it was his own fault for being stubborn and self-righteous. His mother raised him to think he was some kind of moral authority. There was a pause, then Daniel Reeves's voice, quieter but audible. What if someone asks questions? What if... They won't. Margaret cut him off sharply. I've already spoken to the sheriff's department. They're ruling it accidental. We stick to the story. He wandered off during the night, fell tragic accident. Now we clean this up and move on. The recording ended. I sat frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard. My mother had just referred to Oscar's death as something to clean up. Not her grandson. Not a child. Just a problem to be managed. There's more, Sarah said quietly, scrolling through her phone. The next recording was a phone conversation, Margaret's voice slightly muffled as if she were speaking while moving around. Rachel has always been weak, Margaret said, and I recognized the contempt that had colored every interaction we'd ever had. She got that from her father. He was weak, too, abandoned us when things got hard because he couldn't handle responsibility. I swore I'd never be weak like them, never need anyone, never be vulnerable. And I succeeded. The other voice on the line I couldn't identify, who murmured something inaudible. Oh, she'll fall apart completely, Margaret continued. She always does. Remember when her husband left, she could barely function for months. This is worse. Losing Oscar will destroy her and she'll be too broken to cause any real problems. We just need to be patient and let grief do our work for us. I felt Robert's hand on my shoulder, grounding me, keeping me from shattering. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. The last one is the worst. I recorded it 3 nights ago. She'd been drinking, talking to herself in her study. She pressed play, and this time Margaret's voice had a different quality, looser, less controlled, the carefully maintained facade slipping. I was 19 years old when Rachel's father left me, Margaret said, and she sounded almost wistful. Pregnant, broke, completely humiliated. I had to crawl back to my parents and beg for help. They let me stay, but they made sure I felt worthless every single day. You made your bed, they'd say. You were stupid enough to get pregnant, now you deal with it. I heard the sound of ice clinking in a glass. Then Margaret continued. I worked 3 jobs while raising that child. 3 jobs. I was exhausted all the time, barely scraping by, and I swore she would never see me struggle. I swore she would never see me weak. But every time I looked at her, I saw him. Those same eyes, that same naive optimism, that same weakness. Every time I looked at Rachel, I saw the man who abandoned me. And I saw the pathetic girl I used to be. The girl who believed in love, who trusted, who was vulnerable. There was a long pause filled only with the sound of Margaret's breathing. I couldn't love her without hating myself. She said finally, her voice hardening. So I chose power instead. I built this foundation, built wealth, built influence and respect. I became someone people feared, someone who could never be hurt again. And I will not let anyone take that from me. Not Rachel with her judgment and her weakness. Not some self-righteous child who thought he could expose me. I have worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it all crumble because of their moral superiority. The recording ended and the room was silent except for Sarah's quiet crying. "She never loved me," I said, and my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. "She never even tried." "No." Robert's voice came through the speakerphone, gentle but firm. "And Rachel, I need you to understand something important. What you just heard is textbook malignant narcissism. Your mother's entire identity is built on never being vulnerable again. She experienced profound pain and humiliation, and instead of processing it, she armor-plated herself against ever feeling that way again." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "She sees love as weakness, and every relationship as a power dynamic. You represented a threat to her carefully constructed image in two ways. First, by existing at all, you were a living reminder of the vulnerable girl she used to be. And second, by having a good heart and raising Oscar with values, you represented everything she'd had to kill in herself to survive." "And Oscar?" I asked. "Oscar discovered her crimes. To a normal person, that's a problem to be solved through honesty and accountability. To your mother, it was a threat to her entire identity. She's incapable of seeing Oscar as a child who deserved protection. She only saw him as someone who could destroy what she'd built. So, eliminating that threat wasn't murder to her, it was self-preservation." I absorbed this, trying to understand how a human being could become so twisted. "Will she ever feel remorse?" "No," Robert said quietly. "That's the tragedy of this kind of pathology. She's incapable of empathy, incapable of understanding what she's destroyed. In her mind, she's the victim victimized by your father, by her parents, by Oscar, for discovering her fraud, by you for investigating. She'll never see herself as anything other than someone who did what was necessary to survive." Understanding my mother's psychology didn't make forgiveness possible. If anything, it made it clear that forgiveness was meaningless. You can't forgive someone who doesn't understand they've done wrong, who would make the same choices again without hesitation. "These recordings," I said to Sarah, "they're enough, aren't they? To prove what she did. Combined with everything else, yes." Robert confirmed. "Sarah, are you willing to testify to give these recordings to the police and tell them everything you've told Rachel?" Sarah nodded, then realized Robert couldn't see her. "Yes. I'm done protecting her. I'm done being afraid." We spent the next 2 hours with Robert and Michelle Torres on a conference call, going through every recording, every piece of evidence, building the case that would finally bring Margaret down. By the time we finished, it was nearly 4 in the morning. "The guardianship hearing is at 10 a.m., Michelle reminded us. "Get a few hours of sleep. We're ready for this." But when we arrived at the courthouse 6 hours later, Margaret was already there, flanked by her own attorney, a severe-looking man in an expensive suit. And she was smiling. Michelle grabbed my arm. "Something's wrong." Margaret's attorney approached us, handing Michelle a folder. "Counter petition filed this morning. Your client has been embezzling from a memorial fund established in her son's name. We have bank records and witness statements. Given her mental state and her apparent criminal activity, we're asking the court to grant immediate emergency guardianship." I stared at Margaret across the courthouse hallway. She met my eyes and her smile widened. She'd created another trap, and I'd walked right into it. Michelle grabbed the folder from Margaret's attorney and scanned it quickly, her face darkening. "This is fabricated," she said. "We need time to review. The hearing starts in 5 minutes. Margaret's attorney said smoothly. "You'll have to address it in court." We filed into the courtroom, and I felt the weight of every eye on me. Margaret sat across the aisle with her attorney, her posture perfect, her expression one of pained concern. She looked like the picture of a worried mother dealing with a troubled daughter. I wanted to scream. Judge Patricia Ramirez entered, and we all stood. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I prayed she could see through Margaret's performance. This is a hearing on an emergency guardianship petition filed by Margaret Winters regarding her daughter Rachel Winters, the judge began. I've reviewed the initial petition and the counter-petition filed by Ms. Rachel Winters. Let's proceed. Margaret's attorney stood his voice smooth and practiced. Your Honor, we appreciate the court's time on this urgent matter. Ms. Rachel Winters has been experiencing severe psychological distress following the tragic death of her son. However, our concern extends beyond her grief. We've discovered that Ms. Winters has been soliciting donations from community members for a memorial fund in her son's name, then misappropriating those funds for personal use. He presented bank statements to the judge, and my stomach dropped as I saw them a PayPal account with my name showing small donations from various people with withdrawals labeled personal expenses. This demonstrates not only mental instability but potential criminal activity. Margaret's attorney continued. We ask the court to grant emergency guardianship to protect Ms. Winters from herself and to prevent further financial misconduct. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the perfect picture of a heartbroken mother. Michelle stood, and her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Your Honor, may I present evidence to the court? The judge nodded, and Michelle approached the bench with a different set of documents. These are records from PayPal showing that the account in question was created using my client's name and personal information, but the IP address used to create it traces to Margaret Winters' home address. The recovery email is Mrs. Winters' personal account. My client never created this fund, never solicited donations, and never withdrew any money. This is identity theft, Your Honor, perpetrated by the petitioner herself to create a false narrative of her daughter's supposed incompetence. I watched Margaret's face carefully. For just a moment, her mask slipped a flash of rage before she composed herself again. But I saw it. And more importantly, the judge saw it. I'd like to hear testimony. Judge Ramirez said, her tone measured but skeptical. Ms. Torres, do you have witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. I call Sarah Winters. Sarah stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in her hand, trembling as she placed it on the Bible. Michelle guided her through the basics, her name, her relationship to Margaret and me, and then asked, Can you tell the court about your mother's treatment of your sister Rachel over the years? Sarah took a deep breath, and then everything came pouring out. She described growing up watching Margaret systematically diminish me, favor her, control every aspect of our lives. She talked about the foundation's embezzlement scheme, about the financial records Oscar had found, about Margaret's panic when she realized her crimes were being discovered. Margaret's attorney objected repeatedly, but Judge Ramirez allowed the testimony to continue. This is directly relevant to the question of Mrs. Margaret Winters' fitness as a potential guardian, the judge said firmly. Sarah's voice strengthened as she spoke. She described visiting Oscar at camp, the pressure Margaret had put on her to silence him, the terror in Oscar's eyes. She testified about the night Oscar died, about Margaret going to the camp, about the cover-up that followed. My mother is not trying to protect Rachel, Sarah said, her voice breaking but determined. She's trying to silence her, because Rachel is the only person who has the courage to expose what my mother really is. Margaret leaned forward and hissed something to her attorney, her face flushed with anger. The carefully maintained composure was cracking, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. When Sarah finished, Judge Ramirez turned to me. Ms. Rachel Winters, would you like to address the court? I stood, my heart pounding, and walked to the front of the courtroom. I didn't need notes. The words had been building inside me for weeks. Your Honor, my mother is asking for guardianship because she claims I'm not mentally competent. The truth is, I've never been more clear-minded in my life. My voice was steady, stronger than I expected. For 35 years, I accepted her treatment because I wanted her love. I made myself small, quiet, compliant because I thought that's what family required. I thought if I just tried hard enough, she would eventually see me as worthy. I looked directly at Margaret. But losing my son taught me something. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you in the worst moments of your life. My mother didn't stand beside me when I buried my child. She was the reason those moments happened in the first place. The courtroom was completely silent. "I don't need a guardian, Your Honor. I'm grieving, yes, but I'm not broken. I'm not incompetent. I'm a mother seeking justice for her murdered son, and I will not be silenced by the woman who orchestrated his death." Judge Ramirez studied me for a long moment, then turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Winters, do you wish to testify?" Margaret's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, and she shook her head tightly. "Very well," the judge said. "I'm denying the petition for emergency guardianship. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the allegations raised here today regarding identity theft and potential fraud." Margaret's face went white. "This hearing is adjourned." As the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom doors opened. Detective Maria Gonzalez entered with 2 uniformed officers behind her, their expressions grim and purposeful. "Margaret Winters," Detective Gonzalez said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "you're under arrest." Detective Gonzalez walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Margaret remained seated, her attorney standing quickly and positioning himself between his client and the detective. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Your client is under arrest," Detective Gonzalez said calmly. She stood directly in front of Margaret, now pulling handcuffs from her belt. "Margaret Winters, you are under arrest for embezzlement of charitable funds, obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and accessory to manslaughter in the death of Oscar Winters." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Margaret's face went through a transformation I'd never seen before. First shock, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe this was actually happening. Then fury, her face flushing red as she gripped the arms of her chair, and finally something colder and more dangerous. Her eyes found mine across the courtroom, and the hatred in them was so pure, so absolute, that I actually felt my breath catch. "Stand up, please, Mrs. Winters," Detective Gonzalez said. Margaret stood slowly with all the dignity she could muster. The detective moved behind her and secured the handcuffs around her wrists. The metallic click of the cuffs locking echoed in the silent courtroom. "You have the right to remain silent." Detective Gonzalez began reading Margaret her Miranda rights with practiced efficiency. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Margaret's attorney was already on his phone, probably calling for backup, arranging bail, doing whatever expensive lawyers do in these situations. But Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was still staring at me. "You've destroyed this family," she hissed as the officers began to lead her toward the door. I stood and my voice came out quieter than I expected, but clear enough for her to hear. "No, you did that yourself." She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I watched her go, feeling nothing resembling triumph. Just a profound exhaustion and a sense that something that had been broken for a very long time was finally being acknowledged. Robert appeared at my side. "Daniel Reeves is being arrested right now at his office." Gonzalez coordinated both arrests to happen simultaneously so neither of them could warn the other. I nodded, processing this. "And Sarah..." The DA offered her immunity on the most serious charges in exchange for her full cooperation and testimony. She'll still face consequences for obstruction of justice, probably probation, community service, required therapy. But she won't go to prison. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Sarah had helped cover up my son's death, but she'd also been a victim of Margaret's manipulation her entire life, and she'd ultimately chosen to tell the truth. Justice wasn't always clean or simple. The news spread through the community like wildfire. By evening, it was the lead story on every local news channel. I sat in the motel room with the TV on, watching reporters stand outside the courthouse and the foundation's offices recounting the charges, speculating about what evidence had been found. Prominent local philanthropist Margaret Winters was arrested today on charges including embezzlement and obstruction of justice in connection with the death of her 12-year-old grandson, the anchor said. Behind her, they showed footage of Margaret being led from the courthouse, her face set in that cold mask she'd perfected over decades. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some offered support. Others asked intrusive questions. A few reporters had somehow gotten my number and wanted statements, interviews, my side of the story. Michelle had been clear, don't talk to anyone. Don't give interviews, don't comment on social media, don't respond to reporters. Let the legal process play out. The foundation announced it was suspending all operations pending a complete forensic audit. The board members resigned en masse. Families who had trusted Margaret with their children's futures were calling for investigations, demanding to know where their donations had really gone. Mrs. Chen called me that evening. "I always knew something was wrong with that woman," she said firmly. "The way she talked about you, the way she always had to be the center of attention at every neighborhood event. I'm glad you stood up to her, dear. Your son would be proud." I cried after that call, the first real tears I'd shed since the arrest. Mrs. Chen was right. Oscar would be proud. He'd stood up for what was right even when he was terrified, and I'd finished what he started. That night alone in the motel room, I allowed myself to really feel everything that had happened. My mother was in jail. The woman who'd given birth to me, who'd raised me however poorly, was being processed through the criminal justice system, fingerprinted and photographed and held in a cell. The family I'd grown up with no longer existed. Margaret was incarcerated. Sarah had moved out of our mother's house and was staying with a friend while she looked for her own place, trying to build an identity separate from the woman who'd controlled her for 33 years. The foundation Margaret had built was being dismantled, investigated, exposed as the fraud it had always been. I pulled out my phone and looked at photos of Oscar. His smile so bright and genuine, his eyes full of intelligence and curiosity, his hands always dirty from climbing trees or covered in paint from art projects. "I did it, baby," I whispered to the image. "They can't hide anymore. Everyone knows what they did to you." It didn't bring him back. Nothing could do that. But it meant his courage, his determination to expose the truth, hadn't been in vain. He'd found evidence of crimes, and even though it had cost him everything, that evidence was now bringing his killers to justice. A knock at the door made me jump. I looked through the peephole to see a courier holding an envelope. "Certified letter for Rachel Winters," he called. I signed for it and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was an official summons from the district attorney's office. I was being called as the primary witness in the criminal trial of Margaret Winters and Daniel Reeves. The trial would begin in 6 weeks. The 6 weeks before the trial became a blur of preparation. I spent nearly every day at the district attorney's office, a modern building downtown, with fluorescent lights and conference rooms that smelled like old coffee and stress. DA Patricia Morrison was a woman in her early 50s, with steel gray hair and the sharp, focused energy of someone who dedicated her life to prosecution. She and her team, 2 assistant DAs and a paralegal, went over my testimony with exhaustive detail. "The defense is going to try to paint you as an unreliable witness," Patricia explained during one of our sessions. "You're a grieving mother. You're biased. You're emotionally compromised. They'll suggest you're so desperate to blame someone for Oscar's death that you've constructed this elaborate conspiracy theory." "But I have evidence," I said, "and we'll present that evidence methodically and thoroughly. But Rachel, you need to understand what we're up against. The embezzlement case is straightforward. We have financial records, witness testimony, documentation. That part is solid. But the charges related to Oscar's death are more complex." She spread documents across the conference table, creating a visual timeline. "We need to prove a chain of causation. Margaret embezzled funds from the foundation. Oscar discovered evidence of this embezzlement. Margaret and Daniel Reeves became aware that Oscar knew. They took actions to silence him: psychological manipulation, intimidation, threats. Those actions created a situation that directly led to Oscar's death. Each link in that chain needs to be proven beyond reasonable doubt." I studied the timeline, seeing my son's life reduced to dates and evidence markers. "What about the fact that Daniel called Margaret instead of 911, that they staged the scene?" "That's obstruction of justice and accessory to manslaughter. We can prove they covered up the circumstances of Oscar's death." What's harder is proving the death itself wasn't purely accidental. Patricia's expression softened. I want you to be prepared for what the defense will argue. They'll say Daniel was trying to talk to Oscar, that Oscar became upset and ran, that the fall was truly an accident, and the cover-up was just panic, not premeditation. But they terrorized him, I said, my voice rising. They manipulated him, threatened him, put him in that situation. I know, and we're going to prove that. But you need to stay calm and composed on the stand. The moment you appear overly emotional or vindictive, the defense will use it to undermine your credibility. We practiced for hours. Patricia's assistant played the role of defense attorney, asking hostile questions, trying to rattle me, making me repeat the story over and over until I could tell it without breaking down. The breakthrough came when the prosecution's tech experts finished analyzing Oscar's tablet and cloud backup. Patricia called me in urgently one afternoon, and I found her in a conference room with a laptop and a grim expression. "We found something," she said. "The cloud backup included an audio file from the night Oscar died. It's partial, the recording cuts off, but it's enough." My hands went numb. "Can I hear it?" She hesitated. "Rachel, it's going to be very difficult. I need to hear it." She pressed play, and suddenly Oscar's voice filled the room, my baby's voice, alive and real and terrified. "I just want to tell my mom the truth." Oscar said his words slightly muffled, as if the phone was in his pocket. "She deserves to know what Grandma did." Then Daniel Reeves's voice, harder and sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Your mom doesn't need to know anything. This ends here, kid. You're going to forget what you saw, and you're going to stop causing problems." "No," Oscar said, and I heard the fear but also the courage in his voice. "I won't lie for you." There were sounds of movement, a scuffle, Oscar's sharp intake of breath. "Let go of me." More sounds, footsteps, breathing, Oscar's voice rising in panic. "Stop. You're too close to the—" A cry, the sound of something falling, then silence followed by the recording cutting off abruptly. I sat, frozen, tears streaming down my face. Patricia reached across and gently closed the laptop. "That's what happened," I whispered. "Daniel grabbed him. Oscar pulled away and fell." "Yes?" This recording, combined with the medical examiner's report showing bruises consistent with being grabbed, proves Daniel's direct involvement in creating the circumstances that led to Oscar's death. I couldn't speak. Hearing Oscar's last moments, hearing the fear in his voice, knowing he died trying to do the right thing, it was both devastating and validating. My son had been brave until the very end. As the trial date approached, Robert asked to meet me at Millers Creek Park, away from the intensity of the DA's office. I found him sitting on a bench overlooking the creek, and something about his posture told me this conversation was going to be significant. I sat beside him, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I need to tell you something," he finally said, his voice heavy. "Something I should have told you the first day we met, but I was afraid you'd reject my help if you knew." "What is it?" I asked, though a strange feeling was building in my chest. "When I started investigating Oscar's case, I recognized your mother's name immediately. Margaret Winters. 35 years ago I knew her." He paused. "I was 22, a rookie detective, and she was 19. We were together for about 8 months. She got pregnant." My breath stopped. "I wanted to be a father, Rachel. I wanted to marry her, raise our child together. But Margaret, she was already showing signs of the controlling behavior that would define her later. When I questioned some of her decisions, when I suggested we needed to work together as partners, she saw it as a threat." His hands were shaking slightly. "She filed a harassment report against me, claimed I was abusive, stalking her. She got a restraining order. I was barred from any contact." I couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm your father, Rachel," Robert said, finally meeting my eyes. "And I've spent 35 years trying to find a way back to you." The words hung in the air between us. I stared at Robert, at my father, unable to process what I'd just heard. The man who'd been helping me investigate my son's death, who'd guided me through the darkest weeks of my life, was the father I'd never known. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed up. "You're my father." "Yes." His eyes were wet. "I know this is a shock. I know I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid." "Tell me everything," I interrupted. "From the beginning." Robert took a shaky breath and began. "I was 22 years old, fresh out of the police academy assigned to patrol duty. Your mother was 19, working at a coffee shop near the precinct. She was beautiful, charming, and I fell for her immediately. We dated for about 8 months, and she got pregnant." He paused, staring at his hands. "I was terrified, but also excited. I wanted to do the right thing. I proposed, told her we'd figure it out together, that I'd work extra shifts to support us. But Margaret, she had different ideas about what our life should look like. She wanted control over everything. How we spent money, where we lived, how we raised the baby. When I suggested we make decisions together as partners, she saw it as a challenge to her authority." "What happened?" I asked quietly. "You were born, the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen." His voice cracked. "For about 3 months, I tried to be a good father. I'd come home from my shifts and hold you for hours. I'd change your diapers, give you bottles, walk you around the apartment when you cried. But I started noticing things that concerned me. Margaret was so rigid with you. If you cried, she'd leave you in your crib alone, saying you needed to learn independence. She refused to hold you except when absolutely necessary because she didn't want you to become clingy." I felt tears streaming down my face, imagining myself as an infant desperate for comfort that was withheld. "I tried to talk to her about it," Robert continued. "I said babies need affection, need to be held and comforted. She saw it as criticism. One night we had a huge fight. I told her I was worried about your emotional development, that I thought we should see a family counselor. She looked at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before and said, 'If you try to tell me how to raise my daughter, I'll make sure you never see her again.'" "And she did?" I whispered. 2 days later, she filed a police report claiming I'd been physically abusive to her, that I'd threatened her, that she was afraid for her safety and yours. It was all lies, Rachel. Every word. But she was convincing. She had bruises. I found out later she'd inflicted them on herself. She had witnesses, friends she'd coached to back up her story. Within a week, she had a restraining order. I was barred from coming within 500 feet of either of you. The unfairness of it made me physically sick. "Did you fight it?" "I tried. I hired a lawyer, but I was 22 with almost no money. Margaret's parents hired an expensive attorney for her. In court, she cried and told stories about how I'd grabbed her, pushed her, screamed at her while you were in the next room. The judge believed her. My career as a cop was essentially over. No department wants an officer with domestic violence allegations. I ended up leaving law enforcement and becoming a private investigator, partly because I needed work, and partly because I wanted the skills to keep track of you from a distance." "You watched me grow up," I said, the realization sinking in. "I did. I couldn't be in your life, couldn't violate the restraining order without going to jail. But I found ways to know you were okay. I attended your high school graduation sitting in the back where you wouldn't see me. I knew when you got married, when Oscar was born. I have a folder at home with every article you ever wrote for your school newspaper, every award you won, every public record of your achievements." I felt something breaking open inside me, decades of feeling unwanted, unloved, not good enough, suddenly recontextualized. "Why didn't you reach out when I turned 18? The restraining order would have expired." "I tried," he said. "I sent you a letter on your 18th birthday explaining everything. Margaret intercepted it. I found out years later she'd set up mail forwarding from your college dorm to her address for safekeeping. And by then you seemed happy. You had your own life, you were building a career. I convinced myself that showing up and disrupting everything would be selfish, that maybe you were better off not knowing. And then Oscar died," I said. "And then I saw the news report about your son's death at a camp run by your mother's foundation. I recognized the pattern immediately. Margaret's need for control, her willingness to hurt people who threatened her, her capacity for manipulation. I knew she was involved somehow. And Rachel, I saw my chance. I couldn't save you when you were a baby. I couldn't protect you from 35 years of her abuse. But I could help you now. I could finally be the father I should have been all along. I stood up, needing to move to process. Everything I'd believed about my life, about being unwanted, about my father abandoning us, it had all been a lie. Margaret had stolen my father from me before I was old enough to remember him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, turning back to face him. "When we first met—" "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd reject my help if you knew I had my own agenda. Afraid you'd see me as just another person trying to manipulate you. I wanted to earn your trust based on what I did not on biology." I walked back to the bench and sat beside him. "You've been more of a parent to me in these past weeks than she was in 35 years. I don't deserve—" "Yes, you do," I said firmly. "You fought for me when you could. You watched over me when you couldn't. And when I needed someone most, you were there." I took his hand. "I don't know what our relationship looks like going forward, but I'm glad I finally know the truth." He squeezed my hand, and we sat there in silence as the sun set over the creek. The next morning, the trial began. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, community members, families who'd trusted Margaret's foundation, and people whose lives had been touched by her crimes. I sat at the prosecution table beside Patricia Morrison and her team, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Margaret sat with her attorney, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. She looked like a woman wrongly accused, not a criminal facing decades in prison. The judge entered, and we all stood. Judge Catherine Walsh was a woman in her late 60s with gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years on the bench. When she instructed us to be seated, the sound of 200 people sitting down simultaneously echoed through the room. "The state of California versus Margaret Winters and Daniel Reeves," Judge Walsh announced. "Opening statements. Ms. Morrison, you may proceed." Patricia stood and the room went utterly silent. She walked to the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors and 6 alternates. "This case," she began, her voice clear and steady, "is about power control and the lengths one woman went to protect her image. Margaret Winters built a reputation as a philanthropist, a community leader, a devoted grandmother. She hosted charity galas, posed for photos with grateful families, accepted awards for her humanitarian work. But behind that carefully crafted facade was a criminal who embezzled nearly $2 million from a charity that was supposed to help children." I watched the jurors' faces. They were listening engaged. "And when her own 12-year-old grandson discovered her crimes," Patricia continued, her voice hardening, "she and her accomplice silenced him, permanently. Over the next several days, you will hear from witnesses who will describe a pattern of fraud manipulation and ultimately a cover-up that cost a child his life. You will see financial records documenting nearly a decade of theft. You will watch videos of a brave boy who died trying to do the right thing. And when you've heard all the evidence, I am confident you will find Margaret Winters guilty on all counts." She returned to her seat, and the courtroom remained silent for a long moment before the defense attorney stood to give his opening statement. He painted Margaret as a hard-working woman who'd made some accounting mistakes, but whose real crime was being too trusting of others. It was a weak argument, and I could see several jurors looking skeptical. The prosecution's case began with a forensic accountant named Dr. Leonard Chen, who walked the jury through 8 years of Margaret's financial crimes with methodical precision. Charts and graphs were projected onto screens showing the flow of money from donors to the foundation, and then into Margaret's personal accounts through a maze of shell companies and inflated expenses. Mrs. Winters claimed that 85% of all donations went directly to program costs. Dr. Chen explained, pointing to marketing materials that made this promise. In reality, less than 20% reached any child or program. The rest was siphoned off through fraudulent invoicing and payments to companies Mrs. Winters controlled. Margaret's attorney objected repeatedly, suggesting the accounting could be misinterpreted, that these were legitimate administrative costs. But Dr. Chen calmly destroyed each argument with documentation emails where Margaret explicitly instructed staff to inflate expenses bank records, showing transfers to her personal accounts, invoices from shell companies that existed only on paper. After 3 days of financial testimony, it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand in a simple navy dress, my hair pulled back, no jewelry except my watch. I'd learned from Patricia that jurors respond to authenticity, not performance. When I was sworn in and sat down, I looked out at the courtroom and found Robert's face in the gallery. My father. He nodded slightly, and I felt steadier. Patricia guided me through my testimony with gentle but thorough questions. I described Oscar, his intelligence, his kindness, his unshakable sense of right and wrong. I explained how he'd attended the summer program, how his behavior had changed in those final weeks, how I'd learned about the videos only after his death. My son believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. I said, my voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. He paid for that belief with his life. I'm here to make sure his death means something. When Patricia finished, Margaret's attorney stood for cross-examination. Harrison Reed was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent decades defending the wealthy and powerful. Ms. Winters. He began, his tone sympathetic but pointed. Isn't it true that you've been under psychiatric care since your son's death? Yes, I answered, meeting Harrison Reed's eyes directly. I've been seeing a therapist to process my grief. That's healthy, not a sign of instability. He smiled slightly as if he'd scored a point. And isn't it true that you became so distraught after your son's death that your own family feared for your safety? I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. My family feared I would discover their crimes, not that I would harm myself. There's a difference, Mr. Reed. He tried several more angles, suggesting I had financial motivations, implying I'd coached Sarah's testimony, questioning my timeline of events. But Patricia had prepared me well, and every attack only made me appear more credible. I answered each question calmly with specifics he couldn't refute. After 40 minutes, he gave up and sat down. I could see frustration in the set of his shoulders. The next day, Sarah took the stand. She looked small and frightened in the witness box, her hands gripping the armrests. Patricia guided her through the testimony gently, and Sarah described years of Margaret's manipulation, the financial scheme, and the pressure put on Oscar. Then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. Ms. Winters, what did your mother tell you about the night Oscar died? Patricia asked. Sarah's voice shook. She called me around 2 a.m. She said there'd been an accident, that Oscar was dead. But she wasn't upset. She was calm, cold. She told me exactly what I needed to say if anyone asked, that I'd spoken to her on the phone that evening, that we'd discussed foundation business. She said Oscar was taken care of, and we just needed to align our stories. Harrison Reed attacked her credibility viciously during cross-examination, pointing out her immunity deal, her own lies, her complicity. You're testifying to save yourself from prison, aren't you, Ms. Winters? Yes, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. I'm also testifying because I can't live with what we did. A 12-year-old boy is dead because I was too weak to stand up to my mother. That's the truth, whether you believe it or not. The courtroom was silent. Sarah's pain was too raw, too genuine to dismiss as performance. But the trial's most devastating moment came when Patricia played Oscar's video diaries for the jury. The courtroom watched my son's face on the large screen, listened to his voice, trying to puzzle through adult corruption, saw his fear and confusion and ultimate determination to tell the truth. When the partial audio recording from the night he died played, I heard several jurors gasp. Oscar's voice filled the courtroom. I just want to tell my mom the truth. Then Daniel Reeves, harsh and threatening. Your mom doesn't need to know anything. This ends here. The sounds of struggle. Oscar's frightened cry, the silence. I looked at Margaret. She sat motionless, her face a mask showing nothing. That coldness, that complete absence of emotion while listening to her grandson's final moments, told the jury everything they needed to know. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. My heart pounded as the foreperson stood to read the verdicts. In the matter of the state versus Margaret Winters on the count of embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of accessory to manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. I heard the words but couldn't quite believe them. Guilty. On all counts. Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. She grabbed the table in front of her, her knuckles white, her face contorting with rage and disbelief. She turned to look at me, and the hatred in her eyes was absolute. But I met her gaze steadily, without fear. This was closure, not triumph. The bailiff moved to take her into custody. As they led her away, Sarah sobbed quietly in the gallery. Robert's hand found my shoulder steady and warm. 2 weeks later, we returned for sentencing. The courtroom was just as packed, everyone wanting to witness the final chapter. Judge Walsh looked at me over her reading glasses. "Ms. Winters, before I pronounce sentence, would you like to make a victim impact statement?" I stood feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was my last chance to speak, to make Oscar's voice heard through mine. "Yes, Your Honor, I would." I walked to the front of the courtroom, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just about Margaret's punishment. This was about speaking for Oscar, for all the children her greed had hurt, and for the version of myself who'd spent 35 years accepting cruelty as love. "Your Honor, members of the court," I began, my voice steady, "I don't stand here seeking revenge. Revenge won't bring my son back. But I do stand here seeking justice not just for Oscar, but for all the children whose futures were stolen by my mother's greed." I looked directly at Margaret. She stared back, her face a mask of stone. Oscar was 12 years old. He loved science, especially astronomy. He told terrible jokes that made me groan and laugh at the same time. He believed that doing the right thing mattered more than being comfortable. When he discovered evidence of fraud, he could have ignored it. He could have looked away. But he chose truth. And instead of being protected for that courage, he was silenced. My voice grew stronger. My mother had a choice that night. When Daniel Reeves called her in a panic when Oscar lay injured and alone, she could have called for help. She could have sought medical attention. She could have told the truth. Instead, she chose to protect herself. She staged a scene. She destroyed evidence. She let my son die alone in the dark while she crafted a cover story. I paused, letting the words sink in. I don't forgive her for that. Forgiveness requires remorse, and she has shown none. But I release myself from the prison of her manipulation. For 35 years, she controlled my sense of worth, my understanding of family, my ability to trust. Not anymore. She will not control another day of my life. I returned to my seat, and Judge Walsh nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Ms. Winters. I've listened carefully to all the testimony and evidence in this case." She looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Winters, please stand." Margaret stood, her attorney beside her. "You betrayed the trust of hundreds of families who believed they were helping children. You stole nearly $2 million meant for educational programs and enrichment opportunities. And when your own grandson discovered your crimes, you chose to protect your reputation over his life. This court finds your actions unconscionable." Judge Walsh's voice was firm and clear. "On the charges of embezzlement, obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and accessory to manslaughter, I sentence you to 25 years in state prison with a recommendation of no early parole. Additionally, all assets of the Winters Family Foundation are to be seized and distributed to legitimate children's charities. Your personal assets will be liquidated to provide restitution to the families you defrauded." Margaret's face went white, but she said nothing. Daniel Reeves received 18 years. Sarah, who'd cooperated fully and testified truthfully, received 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and was required to make restitution. The judge acknowledged her cooperation while making clear that her actions still had consequences. As they led Margaret away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but peace. Justice had been served. Oscar's death had meaning. 6 months later, I stood in front of a small brick building in a quiet neighborhood watching as workers installed a sign above the door, the Oscar Winters Center for Youth Advocacy. The center had been funded by a combination of restitution money donations from community members moved by Oscar's story and grants from organizations dedicated to protecting children. It would provide free legal support counseling and protection for young people who discovered fraud, abuse, or wrongdoing and wanted to report it safely. Robert stood beside me, my father, a title that still felt new but increasingly natural. He'd taken a position on the center's board of directors, bringing decades of investigative experience to help us develop protocols for protecting young whistleblowers. Sarah approached hesitantly. She'd completed her court-mandated therapy and had asked if she could volunteer at the center. I'd said yes, not because I'd fully forgiven her, but because I believed in second chances and redemption. Our relationship would never be what it might have been, but we were building something new, honest, if not easy. At the center's opening ceremony, I stood before a small crowd and spoke. My son Oscar believed that children have a voice that deserves to be heard. He believed that doing the right thing mattered even when it was scary. This center exists to honor that belief. No child who speaks the truth should face what Oscar faced: silence, intimidation, threats, or worse. Here they'll find support, protection, and adults who will listen. On what would have been Oscar's 13th birthday, I drove to the cemetery. I brought his favorite flowers, sunflowers bright and impossible to ignore, and sat on the grass beside his headstone. "I did it, baby," I said quietly. "I made sure they couldn't hide what they did. Your voice mattered. Your courage mattered. And now other kids will be protected because of you." I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Robert. He sat beside me, and we stayed there in comfortable silence for a while. "He'd be proud of you," Robert said finally. "I hope so," I replied. "I'm finally becoming the mother he deserved, strong enough to fight, brave enough to speak, and free enough to heal." As we walked back to the car, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year: genuine hope. The pain of losing Oscar would never fully disappear, but I'd learned that grief and growth could coexist. I wasn't just surviving, I was building something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. 2 years after the trial, the Oscar Winters Center had helped 43 children safely report wrongdoing, leading to multiple prosecutions and the protection of countless other kids. I'd written a memoir about Oscar's courage and our fight for justice. A documentary was in production. Sarah and I met for coffee once a month now, building a relationship based on honesty, rather than the toxic dynamic Margaret had created. Robert was a permanent part of my life, the father I'd always needed finally here. As I locked the center's doors one evening, I looked up at the darkening sky and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to be brave, Oscar. Your story isn't over, it's just beginning to change the world." Rachel's story teaches us something profound. Family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside us when darkness falls. Oscar's courage reminds us that doing the right thing always matters, even when the cost is high. And Rachel's transformation shows us that it's never too late to break free from those who diminish us, to find our voice, and to turn our deepest pain into purpose that helps others. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt unseen by those who should love you most, or if you believe that truth and justice still matter, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you experienced family betrayal? How did you find the strength to move forward? Please subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and the power of the human spirit. Hit that like button if Rachel's journey inspired you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know. Remember, your voice matters, your truth matters, and you are never alone.